In the very center of the world, there was a snowy wasteland teeming with monsters. While walking there, you could come across a white snake swallowing glaciers whole, or a polar bear that can cause earthquakes simply by walking on the ground. In the snowy wastelands, one could also find a vile rat polluting the seawater. All these monsters brought genuine horror to the inhabitants of the nearby kingdom. But the emperor of that land once declared that the most terrible creatures in the wasteland were not monsters. Many years have passed since then, but the fighting in the wasteland never subsided, and the missing people were never found. Now, in the middle of the snowy mountains, some white-haired girl was finishing off a huge spider monster with her feet. Its impacts were so strong that they caused glaciers to crack and move apart. The girl had a partner who also selflessly fought other monsters. But this man tore his opponents apart with far less elegance than his partner. Seeing another monster, someone headed straight towards it so quickly that only the crunch of snow underfoot betrayed its presence. The huge spider realized what fate awaited him and began to shake with fear, not being ready to face death. The man was clutching his weapon in the form of a long staff. He swung his arm to attack, and the next moment the monster was thrown into the air and mercilessly chopped into several pieces. The man turned to his partner standing behind him and asked him if it was necessary to act like a stupid barbarian, tearing the prey apart with his hands. Then he looked at the girl and asked her how much longer he would have to hang around with these idiots. But she didn't seem to understand what he meant. When all the giant spider victims were defeated, the barbarians began to eat. They ate spider meat so greedily as if it were the most delicious food in the world. Someone approached two barbarians eating meat and said that he had already warned them not to eat this disgusting thing because they risked poisoning themselves. The man came even closer to them and added that less than a second had passed and they had already eaten everything. Trying to hush up the incident, the barbarians suddenly began to praise the man, calling him smart and saying how impressed they were with him. Suddenly, the body of one of the barbarians was struck by pain and he felt something was wrong. White foam began to come out of the barbarian's mouth as if he had been poisoned by something serious. The girl was shouting something, hoping that her partner wouldn't die so easily, but the man just stood and watched what was happening. He continued to look coldly at the body in front of him, and the girl continued to scream shrilly for Greta to wake up. While the barbarian tried unsuccessfully to wake her dead partner, the other man walked away. He thought that this was not what he wanted at all. He seemed not to care about these wastelands or these barbarians, and he was not a local. The young man wanted to enter a world of fantasy, magic, and dreams. He quit his job to travel the world and conquered the highest mountain on Earth. He spent a good few years on his travels, even managing to reach the equator. And he got as far south as it was possible to get. But in the end, nothing changed because reality was as far from fantasy as heaven is from Earth. So every night he prayed to wake up in the real fantasy world, and eventually that prayer was answered. A carriage, accompanied by several dozen mercenaries, moved through the wastelands. The escorts were shaking from the cold and kept talking about who had agreed to this and why. One of them even said that he thought the job was terrible despite the good pay. Having heard for the umpteenth time that his partner considered crossing the snowy wasteland stupid, the boss hastened to shut him up. He said that they all signed up for this, to which the man replied that no one thought it would be this bad. Meanwhile, the people sitting in the carriage also suffered from the cold, but not as much as outside. The man in the suit coughed into his hand, drawing attention to himself. He turned to the girl sitting opposite him and asked if she was okay. The girl smiled and answered in the affirmative. This girl was Melena of the House of Akasha, which was a very recognizable house in the halls of this country. Outside the window, the escorts complained that the girl was not cold, but they were dying from the cold. After hearing the unflattering comments of the man in the suit, the girl asked not to judge them harshly because they were the only ones who agreed to lead them through the snowy wasteland. The girl thought about whether they should let the escorts in to warm up because it seemed like they were very cold. Just after these words, a blizzard descended upon the earth again, knocking people off their feet. But the man sitting opposite her nipped all the girl's compassion in the bud, saying that this was not right and that she herself knew what was out there in the wasteland. Melena looked down and asked again if her escort had just spoken about monsters. A long time ago, an emperor who wanted to rule the whole world decided to conquer the snowy wasteland. So he gathered an army of the best warriors and soldiers. And with such support, he personally set out to conquer the wastelands. Years passed, but the army did not return. The empire, left without an emperor, fell into decline. But one day, the emperor returned. Having lost all his warriors and soldiers, he returned alone, barely alive, speaking like a man who had lost his mind. The emperor mumbled something about there being monsters on the white snowfield. But the most dangerous thing was not them, it was the barbarians. The barbarians lived on a hellish land from which no one ever returned alive. Having caught the lady's train of thought, the attendant said that this was most likely just a legend. But the girl said that it was hard not to believe the emperor's words because most of the monsters he talked about were real. The butler said that no one had ever claimed to have seen the barbarian before. And here Melena was forced to agree with him because there really was no confirmed information. No matter how many stories there are about adventures in the snowy wasteland, no one has ever said a word about the barbarians. The escort squad stopped abruptly, and the boss warned everyone that there was something ahead. He tried to see what they were up against in this wasteland, but the approaching snowstorm made visibility poor. A strange, swaying silhouette was approaching the squad, and the boss still couldn't figure out what it was. But then realization washed over his body, and the man announced that he had good news and bad news. The squad erupted in murmurs of impatience, and the boss continued. The good news was that it was a small thing. The bad news was that it was heading straight for them, which meant it had already noticed them. The escorts from the squad were shocked and could not believe that they would now have to enter into battle. Melena sat in the carriage, looking at everything with an appraising gaze and considering possible scenarios. But her butler's face expressed panic and fear as if this man had already faced death. The boss of the detachment that was supposed to guard the carriage reached out to the scabbard on his belt. But as soon as he pulled the weapon out of its sheath, he looked closer and realized that a man was walking towards them. The man was still approaching the squad, but now they were no longer so afraid. The man's hair was ash gray, making him blend in with his surroundings. Around his neck, he had a necklace made of some kind of monster's fangs, and on his chest there was a huge scar. His eyes glowed with evil purple lights, causing a wave of horror to hit everyone present. The squad quickly realized that this must be one of those very barbarians that the previous emperor had spoken of. The expression on this barbarian's face was clearly not one of friendliness, but on the contrary, expressed his desire to kill. The man spoke up and said that he could no longer stand that gang of barbarians, so he went out for a walk. With a smile on his face, he said that while walking he came across strangers in the wasteland. Ash Barbarian, Katal said that was very fortunate. He smiled even wider and seemed to pose no threat. Katal turned around and looked at the entire trading caravan. He approached the boss of the whole operation and asked him if he was a trader. Then he turned to the mercenaries and asked them if they were the ones guarding the merchant. The barbarian thought for a moment and said that he would advise them to return from where they came, but he doubted that they would follow the advice. At this moment, everyone present became scared once again, thinking about how soon they would be killed. Katal did not stop, and looking at the caravan again, asked if their customer was in the right carriage. He glanced at the most remarkable carriage of them all, which did not look like a cargo carriage at all. Melena, sitting inside the carriage, pricked up her ears, preparing for the worst. The mercenary boss looked at the barbarian with apprehension and could not understand how he had figured everything out so quickly. But then Katal said the most unexpected words, that he was sorry that he too was not hired as their escort. The boss and the mercenaries, all standing in fighting stances ready to attack, asked him what he meant. Katal asked if they didn't understand that he could be their guide through the snowy wasteland. The mercenary boss wondered why the legendary barbarian was offering to help them and what he had in mind. To dispel doubts, the barbarian said that if he wanted to kill everyone present, they would already be dead. This phrase, of course, did not please the mercenaries, who until now had been so confident in their strength. The mercenary turned to his boss thinking that he could somehow fix the situation. But the boss glanced at Katal once more and decided something, getting ready to voice his thought. He approached the carriage and asked Melena if she had heard what the barbarian had said. The girl replied that she had heard everything, but her butler still did not understand the full picture and continued asking stupid questions. The mercenary boss said that the barbarian wanted them to hire him as a guide. The girl thought over all his demands again, not understanding what to do. She asked what the chances were of their mercenaries defeating this barbarian in battle. The mercenary boss said that he personally does not recommend this at all and thinks it is a bad idea. Melena had no choice but to agree to hire the barbarian as an escort. The mercenary boss also did not contradict her decision and was ready to accept the barbarian into his ranks. The man turned on the spot and slowly walked towards Katal and his allies. He loudly announced to the barbarian that permission had been successfully obtained and that he could now join them. The barbarian smiled lightly as if something good had just happened. The man still looked menacing, but he said that this was very good news. The boss and the mercenaries were horrified by the sight of the barbarian for the umpteenth time in the last few minutes. They looked at the figure of Katal standing before them with apprehension and a silent question in their eyes. Noticing the general mood, the barbarian said that they should not be afraid because they were just mercenaries. He then asked to discuss the matter with their employer and to hold it in Melena. As soon as the mercenary expressed his concerns on this matter, Katal said that he would be careful. The young man headed towards the very carriage in which the employer of this entire gang was sitting. The mercenary asked the boss if he was sure that he could allow this barbarian to talk to the customer. But it was too late. Because even though they were elite mercenaries, they would not be able to stop this barbarian. This is exactly what the boss was trying to convey to everyone, repeating over and over again that they should not deceive themselves and that this barbarian was beyond their capabilities. At this time, in the customer's carriage, the butler was going crazy with panic, screaming and twitching. Melena tried to calm him down somehow, but after a few moments there was a knock on the door and someone asked if he could come in. The butler, frightened, loudly sucked in a breath, trying not to scream, and fainted on the spot. The girl lowered her head again and told the man behind the door to go into the carriage. The barbarian's appearance was still intimidating, and his eyes glowed an ominous purple, but now the smile never left his face. The butler, still as frightened as before, sat curled up in the carriage. Barbarian Katal stood in the passageway with his arms crossed over his chest, about to begin a dialogue. He exhaled and said that he would prefer everyone present to calm down. The man said that he did not wish harm to anyone. The butler wanted to object, but was afraid. Melena still couldn't believe that the legendary barbarian was standing in front of them, alive and real. The girl decided to lighten the mood a little and said that she was pleased to meet him. Then the barbarian noticed that it was quite warm in the carriage, although in the snowy wasteland, even indoors, it is not so easy to keep so much warm. Melena looked at the barbarian and said that the warmth was maintained with the help of magic. The young man looked at her and asked again about magic. He said that this place was dangerous, and with only mercenaries, their chances of getting out of here alive were slim to none. So he took it upon himself to protect them, but the barbarian had one condition. Upon hearing the condition, the butler was taken aback and made a strange expression on his face. Melena looked at the barbarian and asked what he wanted and what the condition was. The barbarian smiled and said that he needed knowledge of the outside world. That was his condition. He asked to tell him everything that those present knew about the outside world. Melena was a little confused and did not understand at all why this barbarian was asking for information. He saw that the girl and the butler were confused, so he said that they would not lose anything. However, they had no opportunity to refuse to fulfill such a whim, so Melena was going to agree. She bowed her head and said that she understood everything. Taking this as an affirmative answer, the barbarian spoke again and asked the girl her name. She introduced herself with all courtesy while her butler sat in horror. The man also considered it necessary to introduce himself and said that he was very glad to collaborate with Melena. For as long as he could remember, this man dreamed of living in a fantasy world and one day woke up in the body of a barbarian of the snowy wastelands. He didn't have time to figure out what was happening, so he had to think on the fly. Surrounded by a deadly climate and monsters of unimaginable power, he led the barbarian tribes to survive. They hunted and won. After some time, he continued to fight, doing everything possible to get out of these terrible snowfields. But again and again, all efforts were in vain because his body constantly ran into an invisible barrier. The mystical system gave him warnings that the task was not yet completed, and he could not leave the snowfield. When he was almost in despair, a miracle happened. Katal still could not understand why someone would decide to go to such a place voluntarily. But sometimes he began to meet people from the outside world, and then he realized something important. The world beyond these snowy fields was a land of fantasy and magic that he had always dreamed of. From that moment on, he knew what he had to do. Survival wasn't enough. He had to act. He began to complete tasks one after another, defeating monsters, getting closer with each victory to the exit from the cursed wasteland. Since there was no way out, information from people from the outside world was especially valuable. But most of the people he met simply grabbed their weapons in panic and went crazy. Finally, he had found someone he could talk to. After dealing with uncouth barbarians, talking to a civilized person was like balm to the soul. Katal came out of his thoughts and turned to Melena, asking her if they were transporting weapons. The girl agreed and could not guess how he found out, so she asked about it directly. The man said he could hear the sharp clanging of steel from the carts, so it was hard not to notice. Melena said that in the outside world there is now a war between the Empire and the Kingdom. The mighty Empire has gathered enormous power, but the Kingdom defends itself and will not give up its lands. All because a swordsman and a hero have been sent to the border. Katal perked up when he heard about this. He asked what kind of power these people had. Melena asked if Katal knew about mysticism, to which the man replied that he never left this place. The girl said that she herself did not really understand this, but she continued talking anyway. In this world, there was a power called mysticism. Only a few could feel or use it. They were divided into 10 levels of power. The lowest, the third class, were those who could only sense mysticism. The next level was the second class, which included everyone who already possessed mystical power. The first class were those in whom mystical power manifested itself in the form of mana or aura. Above that was the transcendental level, where ranks lost their meaning. People with a transcendental level freely controlled mysticism. The swordsman belonged to such people. There was also a hero. Creatures that not only possessed mysticism but whose power was capable of shaking the world were living legends. Melena said that their power could be measured by ranks, and there was evidence of their superpowers, but even the third class made a person a significant force. Katal suddenly interrupted the girl's monologue and said that he would like to meet one of them. The man looked out the window and thought that he didn't remember how long he had been suffering here trying to survive. He only knew that the snowfields lay in the very heart of a fantasy world, and there was no way out. Once again, Katal thought that he really wanted to leave these damned snowfields as soon as possible. Thought about something else. A shadow of a slight smile flashed across Katal's face. He looked at his reflection in the carriage window and promised himself that he would definitely get out of there. The carriage continued on its way when Melena asked Katal if he was really a barbarian. He replied that one could say that, and then added that judging by their reaction, they already knew who he was. Melena thought about what she should answer, and then said that there really are legends. The man looked at her in surprise and asked again if these legends were about him. The girl, noticing such a reaction from her interlocutor, covered her mouth with her hand, realizing that Katal had never heard these legends. She told him the legend about the emperor, and Katal only laughed and said that he considered the old man to be a simple madman. Having estimated the approximate time of the events of the legend, Katal said that most likely it is true. Then the man asked if Melena and her companions had a reason to drag so many weapons across the wasteland. Hearing this question, the girl thought for a moment whether she should reveal her reasons. But then she bowed her head and said that they really needed the money. Her family was in the trade. They made a fortune, but envious competitors set them up. Therefore, the girl's family was deeply in debt, and this train was their last chance to save their financial situation. Katal concluded that Melena's family was going to sell weapons to a kingdom that was at war with the Empire. The girl was perplexed by the fact that the barbarian figured everything out so quickly. But in reality, everything was clear as day. The Empire was rich, which meant there were enough weapons. It turns out that the kingdom needed weapons. The shortage raised the price where demand was high and supply was low. Katal didn't know the prices beyond, but such a load must have been worth a fortune. Risking his life to cross the waste might be worth it. And also, since the girl decided to make her way through the snowy wastelands, this was the only way to the kingdom, which suggested that her land bordered the Empire. Having heard such conclusions, Melena was even more surprised and could only confirm his guesses. This did not fit into her head because, as a rule, barbarians were uncouth and uneducated people. As soon as she asked the question about what Katal was like, the carriage began to shake. The wheels seemed to hang in the air, continuing to spin like crazy. The butler was immediately horrified and, looking around, tried to figure out what was going on. The butler's jaw dropped at what he saw outside the window, while the rest of those present continued to maintain concentrated expressions on their faces. Katal coldly informed everyone that they had an uninvited guest. A creature that vaguely resembled a giant worm appeared in front of a group of mercenaries in the wasteland. The head of the mercenaries seemed to recognize the monster and was horrified as soon as he realized what he was facing. Melena also looked very scared, looking at the monster through the glass. She said it was black slime, and Katal continued to watch everything, replying that he finally knew what it was called. Melena said that this was the monster described in the notes. Having heard about the notes, Katal decided to ask again and find out the details. Over the years, many strong men have braved the white snowy wasteland, but only a few have survived to tell the tale. Those who survived recorded what monsters they encountered, and black slime was mentioned most often. Melena looked at her interlocutor and asked him if he knew about this monster. The man said that the monsters actually made a pretty good snack. The girl looked at him with bewilderment in her eyes and asked if Katal really ate them. And he, in all the kindness of his heart, offered the girl to catch one for her. A roar was heard outside the carriage window, and Melena shuddered from the sharp sound. Somewhere out there, a band of mercenaries was still trying to decide whether to attack this creature first. The head of the mercenaries looked at the approaching danger with fear. Melena's face also expressed undisguised fear, she called Katal. At the same time, the man sat without showing any signs of fear. Remembering something, the barbarian began to talk about how he had made a contract with them. He said that he would protect their lives, but would not interfere until it became truly dangerous. Melena looked at him with bewilderment in her eyes and asked what he meant. And Katal replied with a smile that these guys could handle the danger themselves. And besides, he was interested in assessing their level. The battle continued to escalate, and the leader of the mercenaries ordered everyone to raise their shields. His partners immediately carried out the order, covering themselves with wooden shields. The next moment, the huge creature hit the shields without causing much damage to anyone. The man who bore the brunt of the blow stepped back. The worm decided to go all out, so it continued to push its victim further and further away. At that moment, another mercenary jumped into the air and swung at the huge worm. He was immediately thrown aside by some unknown force, but at least he was able to touch the monster. The mercenary's weapon lay on the ground as a strong blow had knocked it out of his hands, and the giant monster continued to roar threateningly while the leader of the mercenaries came up with a new plan. He said that the black slimes could only move in a straight line, so everyone needed to spread out. Having heard his order clearly and distinctly, the mercenaries agreed and ran off in different directions. They assumed fighting stances with concentrated expressions on their faces, ready to strike again. Another blow sounded, raising snow across the wasteland. The huge monster still did not want to give up, and still stood in front of the mercenaries, angry and threatening. One of the mercenary team jumped into the air and swung at the monster. The monster howled in pain from the unexpected blow he received. And then his tone changed, and now he was making threatening sounds, opening his mouth wide. The mercenary concentrated grains of some kind of magical energy around his weapon, and he launched his pole into free flight straight towards the monster's body. The weapon, in the form of a huge stick with a pointed end, seemed to pierce the monster and pass through it. The monster writhed and screamed in pain as its body tore apart in different places and self-destructed. Seeing that this was their chance to win, the leader of the mercenaries ordered everyone to attack and not surrender. He personally delivered another slashing blow, which also passed right through the monster. The man realized that this creature would not die from simple blows, so he needed to aim at its core. After a series of quick and accurate strikes, the mercenary captain stood with his sword raised above the monster. He struck straight at the core of the black slime, and that was the final blow to kill it. The small red stone that represented the monster's core cracked. The monster began to disperse as soon as its core split. There was a silence of disbelief among the mercenaries that they had finally dealt with the danger. And then they screamed loudly, rejoicing that they had killed this black worm. Melena looked at her personal guard with pride and shared their joy. But Katal continued to look at everything with an indifferent face, and didn't even rejoice. The mercenaries suddenly noticed that there was another monster in front of them in the form of a huge white wolf. The commander ordered the mercenary closest to the monster to strike the creature on the neck. The two young men worked in harmony, with one attacking and the other covering him from blows. One of the mercenaries approached the monster and raised his weapon to strike, trying not to get into trouble. The monster began to disperse from the blow, which was good. It meant they had guessed where to hit. After the battle, one of the mercenaries said that there was nothing new in the white snowy wasteland. In response to his colleagues' words that all the dangers of the wasteland were just rumors, the man asked them not to lose their vigilance. Then one of the mercenaries asked if that barbarian was really that strong, because now it began to seem to him that all the monsters and such were just fairy tales of the emperor. They say this barbarian is at the very bottom of the food chain in the white snowy wasteland, so maybe he used them. The head of the mercenaries looked at the carriage and said that it was worth testing his abilities. At this time, Melena was sitting in the carriage, surprised by Varvara's words. Katal watched everything that was happening between the mercenaries with interest. One of the mercenaries approached the carriage and addressed Melena, saying that he wanted to talk to her. He said that the mercenaries are risking their lives to carry out this task, so they want to check on Katal. Melena said that she was grateful to the mercenaries and thought about the fact that these people were the only ones who agreed to such a task. The man said there was something else that was bothering him. According to him, the barbarian who was riding with them had never fought before. The mercenary said he wanted to verify his fighting abilities, and then added that he had a bad feeling about it. Melena shook her head, understanding what kind of test they were talking about all this time. Then the head of the mercenaries approached the talking people and was about to report something. The man said that he tried to hush it up, but they didn't listen to him, as if trying to justify themselves to Melena. Then, out of nowhere, Katal came out and asked if they wanted to test his skills. The man said he was not against the inspection, but was afraid it was impossible at the moment. When the mercenaries began asking questions, the barbarian replied that they had another guest. And in confirmation of his words, a voice was heard from behind the mercenaries saying that some pathetic mortals had reached this land. The mercenaries tried to disperse and get into fighting stances when the voice said that he would have a decent dinner. This strange voice belonged to the huge white snake, which until now had so cleverly camouflaged itself in the wasteland. Melena was horrified and screamed as soon as the monster approached her. A wave of icy cold attacks passed through everyone present. Katal stepped forward as if not afraid of the cold, and clearly stated that they were his guests and that the snake would do well to leave. The snake began to ask why he was here and whether he had forgotten the rules. When the monster was about to quote one of these rules, Katal stopped him and said that it was none of his business. Then the snake swirled in the whirlwind even more and said that he was a barbarian nicknamed the Snake, and how Katal knew how to command him, the snake who was promised eternity. As soon as these words were spoken, Katal raised his hand to strike and said that the snake was asking for a beating. The barbarian hit the snake with such force that its thick skin gave way. The snake began to wriggle and scream, still trying to strike Katal. Then this creature curled up into a cocoon and covered the entire space within a few meters. The mercenaries remained outside this dome and realized that they were not in any danger. A huge crater formed where the snake had just been, and the blast waves spread further and further. Melena was blown away by the rising wind, and her butler kept turning to her. Katal, having beaten the snake, said that some people began to listen only after a good beating. Melena was shocked that Katal stood in front of her hole and the snake was barely breathing on the ground. The man said he would go and deal with the rest, which shouldn't take long. He pushed off the ground beneath his feet, and strange streams of magic spread out from that spot. The barbarian rose into the air and immediately headed towards his new opponents, trying to deal with them as quickly as possible. He raised his fists again and again to strike, putting more force into each blow. A blue cloud of light caused by numerous battles burst forth over the snowy wasteland. Melena and the butler looked at everything that was happening, stunned, frozen in place. After some time, the mercenaries came to Katal to beg for mercy for doubting him, and he replied that he understood everything. The caravan continued to advance across the snowy wasteland without losses. Now the butler sat inside the carriage, shivering from the bone-chilling cold. Katal still maintained an imperturbable and thoughtful expression on his face. Suddenly he turned to the girl and said that since she mentioned it, he became curious about something. Judging by her clothes and manner of speaking, Katal doubted that she was just a family agent. Why then risk her life and personally accompany the caravan? For the first few seconds, the girl did not know what to answer to such a sharp question. She said that she was the first daughter of the concubine Biliak from the year of Kasaka. Once a concubine married for political reasons, but she was used and rejected. Her mother never had any power and they were formally a family, but in reality they were nothing. They were treated like servants. Clutching the fabric of her skirt tighter, the girl thought that she hadn't meant to talk so much. Then she added that she herself volunteered to take part in this trading expedition. Even if it was a matter of life and death, she said, someone had to lead by example. Katal smiled and said that he understood everything, and also added that the girl turned out to be quite smart. He continued to talk about how she had big ambitions, even, one might say, greedy ones. Melena wanted to say something else, but as soon as she started her sentence, screams were heard from the street. The barbarian looked sharply in the direction from which the strange sound came. Melena also looked there, but with more enthusiasm than Katal. The mercenaries began to talk among themselves about how it was a miracle that they had arrived. A view of the steppes opened up before them. This meant that they had passed through a snowy wasteland. Melena thanked Katal. She answered all his questions, and it turned out that she was going to return home through the Empire. Then the girl called him by name, which made Katal wary, and he began to listen more attentively. She said that he had said she was ambitious, and now she wanted to ask what he meant. The barbarian replied that he meant exactly what he said, because he considered her smart and ambitious. Her family was once famous, but now it is unstable. But even as a concubine's daughter, if she takes the initiative and finds a way forward, then success awaits her. Katal asked her who she thought the others would trust and follow, and also said that Milena's goal was to gain real power in the family. He asked about power, but there was no answer, so the man asked again if he was wrong, but all his guesses turned out to be correct. The girl confirmed this by lowering her head. Risking everything as a child of a concubine for the future of the family, such a story, in Katal's opinion, could have happened in any era. Melena looked at the barbarian and thought that he was perceptive, not like those blockheads who only pretended to be smart. The girl assessed him once more and then decided to tell him that If he ever decided to leave the wasteland, he could come with her. When asked whether Katal wanted to join her, the man could not answer the way he wanted, and he understood it. Therefore, Katal said that he had to refuse for now because he still had unfinished business. Melena took his words with understanding and came up with something. She showed Katal a gold pendant and said that in that case, he should accept it. If he ever got out and was looking for Akasha's house, if he needed to show this token, Katal smiled and said that if it was a gift, he would gladly accept it. When it was time to say goodbye, even the butler, who had been showing his fear the whole way, thanked Katal. The barbarian stood on the edge of the snowy wasteland and watched the cart moving away from him. 5 years later, the man was still on that same white, snowy wasteland. Finally, he completed all the levels that the persistent system had prepared for him. And immediately after the notification that he could leave the snowy wasteland, Katal took his first steps into the real world. This was the same fantasy world he had always dreamed of, and now he had a chance to see it. Katal was very happy to get out into freedom and breathe in the smell of fresh grass. He could no longer imagine that he would ever again feel all these smells and sensations of freedom. He found this truly beautiful, as none of this could be found in the snowy wasteland. The man turned towards the wasteland he had just emerged from. He folded his hands into a tube and shouted loudly that he hoped he would never see this place again. It was a fantasy world that he had dreamed of, a place he never thought he would find himself in. At first he had to spend several years in terrible survival, but now he was going to enjoy this world. He expected to see magic and fencing, dragons and elves, and everything that fantasy could offer. If it weren't for this desire, he would have died long ago, since the snowy wasteland was hell. Katal looked at the forest ahead of him and saw lights sparkling above the trees. This meant that there were many people ahead. The barbarian assumed that there was a village there, and he had finally found a real settlement. He told the barbarians so many times that they needed proper shelter, but they simply dug holes in the snow and slept in them. Therefore, Katal greatly missed the well-built human village. He thought about what he should say when he met these people. Katal moved further through picturesque meadows that looked just like something out of a fairy tale. Suddenly, he encountered an old man above him shouting something. This old man was leading several people and was talking about how from now on, this would be their new home. The elves followed him. There were women, men, and children who were happy about their new home. The old man climbed a tree and told everyone to start unpacking. Then one of the elves approached the old man and addressed him. The young man asked if the elder was sure that this place was safe. According to the old man, this area was wild and remote, so people would not get here. Then the young man expressed concern that there was a snowy wasteland nearby, but the old man assured him that there were no monsters here. According to the old man, nothing has come out of the wasteland for 2,000 years, and besides, they put up a barrier. The barrier hid their presence and made the place look like an ordinary forest. As long as the barrier held, no outsider could approach this place. According to him, even if the monsters appear, their queen will always be with them. The monsters wouldn't be able to reach her, and the elder was completely confident of that. The young man walked up to the barrier and ran his hand along it. Katal stood in front of the barrier in confusion, thinking that he seemed to have broken something. He continued on his way forward, lamenting that he still had a long way to go. Then he looked to the side and noticed something strange. There, in the middle of the forest, stood a girl whose ears were stretched out like an elf's. It seemed she had gone too far and got lost. But Katal only thought about the fact that there were elves in this world. This was a real elf. One of the first races that came to mind when the word fantasy was mentioned. The man didn't expect to meet one of the elves so early. For him, it was a bit of luck to get to know the structure of this world so quickly. The little elf girl thought that she had gone too far and she was scared. Then she looked up because a black shadow suddenly covered her. Horror was reflected in her eyes as soon as she saw the one standing in front of her. Katal, looking far from friendly, leaned over to the girl and greeted her. The poor thing was petrified with shock, thinking that today would be the day of her death. And then the little girl fainted out of fear. The birds began to leave en masse the place where Katal had just so unsuccessfully tried to meet the elf. The man caught the girl before she fell to the ground, unable to find any words to describe the situation. He looked at the elf with shock and concern in his eyes. He barely had time to say anything, and she suddenly lost consciousness. Katal decided to take the child to the village. In most worlds, elves were a peaceful, orderly race, so if he returned the girl to the village, he would be treated as a good person. In anticipation of meeting the elves, Katal decided to carry the child to the settlement. He smiled and admitted to himself that he was a little excited. The unconscious girl sat in his arm looking asleep, and the man walked towards the village. But as soon as he arrived at the settlement, the elves started shouting that there couldn't be a human here, and then they shouted something about a girl. They stood with spears and asked Katal how he got through the barrier, and the girl's mother cried. The elf continued to cry, shouting something about her daughter, thinking that she would lose her. The elder thought that this could not be, since this place should be inaccessible to people. He was told that there was a crack in the barrier, and the old man immediately asked where the queen was. Katal was still trying to prove to the elves that he was not their enemy, but they continued to threaten him. The elder thought that they had been exposed. The barrier was created using ancient elven techniques, so it could not be penetrated by normal means. If it was destroyed, then people had prepared in advance. The old man was frightened by the thought that they had been watched for a long time. Katal, stunned by what was happening, thought that he was probably mistaken for the kidnapper. He urgently needed to explain that this was just a misunderstanding. The girl he was holding apparently came out of her swoon and began to tremble and cry. Tears welled up in her eyes as Katal finally decided what he needed to do. Her eyes widened as if someone had just saved her life. At that moment, Katal put the elf on the ground and told her to return to her people. The girl turned around to look again at the face of that strange man from the forest. In her eyes, Katal looked very scary and threatening, more like a monster. The girl was terrified again and ran towards the elves. She cried and ran to her mother while Katal wondered if his face was really that scary. He was shocked because he had always thought he looked quite normal. In any case, he returned the child, so now it was time for a dialogue with the elves. The old man didn't even want to listen to what Katal was saying, so he shouted that the hostage had been freed and that everyone needed to join the fight. The elves took out their crossbows and bows and pulled the strings, preparing to shoot at Katal. As Katal watched the arrows approaching him, he thought that no one here could even hear what he was saying. Katal tensed and thought that the elves were much wilder than he imagined. The elves of legend were supposed to be a peaceful people who loved nature and sought peace, but these were cruel. Katal attributed this to the fact that they were a race that lived in the wild. Katal understood that nature is a world where the strongest survives, so the ferocity of the elves is quite natural. The barbarian thought for a moment, realizing what it was really like and ignoring the arrows attacking him. The elves pointed their weapons at the barbarian and shouted that he had some kind of artifact, but everything must have its limits, so it was worth continuing the attack. Then the blonde barely raised his hand and quietly muttered that the elves could be calmer. The barbarian clenched his palms and a purple force immediately burst out around him, blowing away everything around him like a stream of wind. And then the man sent heavy stones in a certain direction, blowing up everything alive there. One of the elves clenched his teeth and tried to cover his face with his hands as the furious force was directed at him. The archers screamed in fear, and then the order was given to deploy the barrier. But their gaze only fell on the tree, which the man managed to uproot and direct after the stones. The elves suddenly rose into the air, still trying to somehow resist the barbarian's power. But the shockwave continued to grow, and after a few moments, the guy turned the entire area into chaos. The man's attack was like a huge explosion of purple energy that destroyed all living things. A man sank to the ground, holding his wooden staff tighter. The old elf came out to them and trembled in fear, asking what the hell that was. Katal stood in the middle of the scorched earth, his hands down, saying that he was not their enemy. The barbarian's eyes widened, realizing that he had gone a bit too far, and then turned to the elves. But the young man's words were interrupted by a fiery arrow which a moment later was directed at him. The barbarian only had time to turn around in surprise before the arrow almost hit his head. And just a moment later, there was a huge explosion that burned everything alive near Katal. The old man and the other elves watched what was happening in surprise, their eyes wide open. And then the men's gaze caught on the long braid of the girl with blonde hair. The girl stood on a stone in green shoes with a small heel, watching the elves. The elves greeted Her Majesty, who was dressed in a dress with leaves, in surprise. Marcelia Hassiane Corellia was the heroine of Apaya and the queen of the List clan. She asked what had happened. The old man exclaimed to Marseille in a trembling voice that a man had attacked them. Then the girl's blue eyes dimmed for a moment, and then she barely shook her head. Grabbing the arrow on her back, she said that this place was no longer safe either. The clouds of smoke began to clear, and through them the terrifying silhouette of Katal could be seen, asking them to wait. Emerging from the clouds, the barbarian scratched his head in bewilderment and said that he would be grateful if they listened to him. The queen immediately recoiled in fear, as if she were looking at the living corpse of a man. The old man cried out in fear that the barbarian remained unharmed even after a direct blow from Her Majesty. Grabbing the bow, the girl said that even a strong man like him hunts them. Frowning more deeply and looking at Katal with disgust, she said that people really were disgusting. Pulling back the bowstring, the girl said that she was the queen of the indigo-dyed Leaf clan. Turning to the man, the blonde looked at him tensely and turned around. Her Majesty then aimed at the barbarian using flaming arrows again. And then the girl exclaimed that she would make the barbarian pay for his greed. Katal wondered if Marseille couldn't understand him, even though they clearly spoke the same language. He realized that relations between humans and elves were so bad that she ignored him. The guy realized that in this case he was powerless, because this was one of the rules that he had learned in the tundra. The man's eyes flashed angrily as he thought about how people only started listening after being hit on the head. Then the blonde's gaze fell on the arrow, which had already begun to smoke with a strange blue fire. The girl took another look at the barbarian in front of her as energy hovered around her. And just a moment later, the girl shot a blue arrow, and it immediately caught fire in the air. A huge monster appeared in front of the barbarian as if it was woven from blue energy. And then the blonde frowned slightly and swung his sword at the animal. Having hit the monster's face, purple energy began to develop around it like a shockwave. And then a huge blue spark appeared near Katal's body, forming a crater. And then, the monster's body seemed to crumble and dissolve in the air currents. The blonde screamed in fear and suddenly recoiled, watching the barbarian. And then the man froze for a moment, suddenly realizing that he had made a mistake. Then a girl's scream was heard as the barbarian's blue energy covered the entire sky again. After some time, the girl found herself among clouds of smoke on the ground, which had cracked. Katal looked at the queen in bewilderment, realizing that he should have restrained himself even more. Marselia looked at the aftermath of the blow in fear, her blue eyes wide. Marselia didn't understand why someone so powerful, even stronger than a transcendental level, was among them. But the girl's anger quickly passed. She lowered her head and ordered everyone to leave that place immediately. The elves began to look at the queen with fear and ask her again in a trembling voice. Turning around sharply, Marselia clenched her fists and ordered all the elves to run quickly. This time, her subordinates obeyed her order and began to run away from the barbarian as quickly as possible. Marselia exclaimed that she acknowledged the man's strength, but he would never be able to achieve his goal there. Katal glanced awkwardly at Marselia and repeated that he just wanted to talk. He thought that things were clearly not going according to his plan, and the girl closed her eyes again and began to call upon the one who preserves the essence of pristine purity. Flames began to emerge from Marselia's hands, and she called upon the one who carries the black darkness, the one with horns and made of pure flame. Then the blonde suddenly opened her eyes and looked sternly at the result of the summoning. The blonde stretched her hand towards the sky, from where a huge fiery spot appeared, spreading across the sky. Then a huge bull named Piego appeared in the sky, his skin looking like it was on fire. Katal looked at the call in fascination, thinking that the creatures in the tundra were ugly and strange. Remembering the monsters, Katal thought that, of course, there were more fabulous monsters, but most were simply disgusting. Looking at the hostile creature in front of him, Katal thought that it was a bull with horns of blazing fire. Clenching his fist, his eyes sparkled brightly. He thought that this was real fantasy. But then came Marselia's order to destroy the enemy in front of her. The bull turned around and grinned, thoughtfully saying that the contracts weren't worth it. They were nothing but trouble. But the girl responded with a sharp glance at the creature and ordered it to be silent. Piego is a being that embodies pure flame. The stronger the spirit, the more ancient it is, and the greater its pride. Marselia could hardly summon it with her power. But the girl was only able to make a contract with the help of another tribe. She could not even imagine that she would call him under such circumstances. And then the girl frowned even more and again gave the order to Piego to fulfill the contract. The bull finally came down to the ground and asked if the contract was simply to kill the man standing in front of him. But then the creature suddenly frowned more deeply, as if thinking about something. The barbarian's smile was terrifyingly frightening. He smiled widely and his gaze burned with a violet flame. When the blonde smiled even wider, looking at the bull with a bewildered expression, he asked if he really was a human being in front of him. The creature suddenly began to burn even more intensely with flames, turning sharply. Katal looked at the amazing summoned beast with admiration, thinking that he was really in a fantasy world. But his admiration was interrupted by Marseille's cold voice, which said that a man had invaded their lands. The bull frowned even more and growled sharply that a pathetic man dared to encroach on the power of nature. The bull exclaimed that he had already decided to turn the man into ashes, into nothing. The man looked at the creature in bewilderment, and then the bull's eye flashed brightly and he himself flared up even more brightly as he looked at Katal. The bull began to prepare for the slaughter, squatting for a moment and stamping his hoof on the floor. And just a moment later, the hellish creature pounced on the barbarian, carrying flames behind it. But the blonde continued to absent-mindedly look at the creature in front of him, which he had admired so much earlier. And then the ground shattered into pieces, and the shockwave sent hundreds of heavy stones flying into the sky. The blonde almost fell, barely maintaining her balance and covering her face with her hands from the explosion. But then the girl suddenly opened her eyes, looking in surprise at what was happening in front of her. The barbarian's hand held tightly to the creature's horn, which forced it to stop. The barbarian easily held the horn of the surprised bull, not giving it a chance to strike. Then Katal chuckled and said that since it was a beast form, he was calm. The blonde swung his arm sharply and his face seemed to fade while his eyes flashed again. Katal exclaimed that it would be easier to beat the bull to death. It seemed as if Marcelia stopped breathing for a moment. The bull still tried to escape from the barbarian's grip, but he struck at it faster. And then a bright spark of flame appeared in the sky, which seemed to eclipse the entire forest. The shockwave from the explosion extended for several hundred kilometers, passing through much of the forest. The huge explosion seemed to even fly out of the atmosphere, destroying all living things in its wake. Bright tongues of flame burned every tree in their path, lifting the remains of the earth into the air. Marcelia screamed in fear, falling to the ground and covering her face with her hands. But the blonde was still extremely focused, continuing to firmly hold the enemy's body. After some time, the girl sank to the ground and absent-mindedly asked what it was. The queen sat among the rubble of scorched earth, whispering that this could not be. The barbarian then began to slowly approach the girl, ignoring the clouds of smoke around him. As the man came closer to her, the girl suddenly lowered her head. Tizo, pleading and looking down, the queen asked only to spare her relatives. But the man came even closer to her and said that he was not an enemy of the elves at all. Then Marcelia suddenly opened her eyes wide, still not taking her gaze from the floor. Marcelia looked up at the barbarian in surprise, then asked again in bewilderment. Then they had a very long conversation where the man tried to justify himself. The queen put her hand to her mouth, finally realizing that the man really wasn't her enemy. She put her hand to her heart and awkwardly asked for forgiveness, saying that they had jumped to conclusions. The girl understood that they had taken the one who saved the child of their clan for an ill-wisher. The girl closed her eyes and thought that for Katal this was probably a terrible insult. The guy smiled and said that everything was fine because people had driven them out. He added that he was still a little sad because he had not been given the chance to explain. The blonde was silent for a moment and then asked if it was true that Katal was not the type of person who wanted to conquer them. The barbarian looked at her with curiosity, saying that it was the first time in his life that he saw an elf because there were none in the snowy wasteland. And then Marcelia's eyes widened and she asked the man again in bewilderment. Marcelia muttered that this was an ash barbarian from the wasteland. He replied that this was what foreigners usually called him. Clenching her fists, the girl muttered that she had previously believed that people could not survive in the snow wasteland. The girl asked tensely if the barbarian's return from the wasteland meant that others would be able to get out of there too. The man thoughtfully replied that it was unlikely that anyone else could do it, but anything was possible. Katal recalled that in the wasteland there are strict rules. Even powerful creatures cannot break them. The man recalled that for some reason unknown to him, he was able to bypass the snakes as a task. Katal looked down sadly and thought that this was probably a very rare exception. Marcelia sighed with relief and said that everything was fine then. Katal asked if everything was okay with her summoning. Katal smiled awkwardly and said guiltily that he had cut the creature in half. Marcelia advised him not to worry because spirits are creatures of nature. If the connection with the summoner is broken, they simply return to the spirit world. Getting up from the ground, Marcelia said that she had insulted the barbarian, so how could she make amends for her guilt? Katal muttered thoughtfully that the fiery bull turned out to be a spirit of nature after all. Katal asked curiously if creatures other than elves could make contracts with spirits. The girl awkwardly looked away in response and thoughtfully said that most likely this was impossible to accomplish. Marcelia said that among humans, those with a strong connection to nature can sometimes make contracts. Katal replied that it was still impossible. But then the girl fell silent for a moment and pressed her lips tighter into a thin line. Marcelia said that if Katal wanted to make a contract with a spirit, he should go to Elfo Sagrado. Marseille said that in that sacred land of the elves their god lived. There it was possible to make a contract even for a human. The barbarian smiled good-naturedly and thoughtfully asked if they would really let a man like him onto the sacred land of the elves. Marcelia replied that they usually don't let them in, but with her recommendation, it's possible. She'll tell you how to get there. But Katal must keep it a secret. The girl understood that the sacred land of the elves, Elfo Sagrado, was the dream of every explorer of their race. But for the elves, allowing a human to approach that place is incredibly dangerous. They value that place above their own lives, and no elf will reveal the location of the city. Marseille extended his hand from which appeared a small, fiery-colored crystal in which a snake seemed to be sealed. Marcelia handed the stone to the barbarian, saying that she wanted to believe him, so let him take it with him. Katal looked at the girl awkwardly at first, but then extended his hand, saying that he would accept the gift with gratitude. Marcelia said that even if Katal came closer, the elf god could still test him. The girl smiled kindly, saying that Katal would surely cope, and then wished him luck. The girl smiled kindly and introduced herself, pressing her hands to her chest. Then she asked what the barbarian's name was. In response, the man also smiled good-naturedly and introduced himself, calling himself a barbarian named Katal. And after some time, the man decided to use force, lifting stones into the air. Katal jumped high into the air and swung his arm to attack, circles of his energy hovering around him. The blonde then leaned forward sharply and extended his hand forward as his eyes flashed brightly. Then the barbarian ran with all his might into the forest, trying to avoid colliding with the trees. And just a few moments later, Katal suddenly jumped up and rode on, lightning from his energy, running across the forest. On the border of the territory of Barkin, the kingdom of Gehent, the military heard strange sounds, deciding that something was approaching them. The head of the guard shouted, giving the order to ring the bell faster and raise the military on alert. And then from the forest in front of him appeared huge clouds of smoke that reached to the sky. And then a silhouette of a man emerged from them, moving deliberately slowly. Katal looked sternly at the guards in front of him, ignoring the devastation behind him. The soldiers continued to look at the man in front of them in fear, staggering sharply. The blonde smiled good-naturedly and harmlessly and said that he was glad to meet them, and 3 soldiers immediately pointed spears and swords at him. Katal stared at them in bewilderment, frozen. The soldiers were almost shaking with fear, wondering if this guy could really have made such a noise. Katal felt awkward under such scrutinizing glances, and so he awkwardly turned away. The head of the guard looked at the man carefully, suddenly thinking that this was impossible. An image of a stern man among the ice appeared in their imagination. He asked if it was really an ashen barbarian in front of him. But the man ignored his question, only taking a few steps forward. The leader loudly ordered the barbarian to stand still and not move, otherwise they would defend themselves. The barbarian extended his hand and said that the military should calm down because he was not their enemy. The soldier didn't even think of lowering his sword, only tensely asking what the barbarian wanted from them. But the man again ignored the question of the soldiers in front of him, only raising his hand up. The ash barbarian then pointed his finger at the door that was behind the military. The head of the guard immediately opened her eyes wide, looking at the man in front of her in bewilderment. Turning around abruptly, the soldier told the ashen barbarian that there was just an ordinary wall there. Katal said harmlessly, his eyes wide, that he would like to visit the territory of the elves. The soldier stared at the barbarian in bewilderment, still not fully understanding his intentions. Katal said thoughtfully that if possible he would like to stay with them for a while, but he didn't know for how long yet. A military man was sitting at the table with him and asked him to state his name, and he immediately introduced himself. The head of the guard asked if Katal had anyone who could confirm his identity or any document. The man replied that he had nothing of the sort. Then his eyes suddenly widened, lost in memories. Katal remembered the blue-haired girl who thanked him and handed him a gift. Then she said that if Katal ever visited Akasha's house, he should show her this item. And he kept that ornament until now. Holding out a blue brooch, Katal asked if this was enough to confirm his identity. The soldier's eyes widened in surprise, and he asked what kind of decoration it was. Katal replied that it was the crest of the House of Akasha, which he had received from someone in that family. The soldier replied that the Akasha were a merchant family from Dinion. The soldier said that this was a house that had recently gained in prominence. Their influence had grown rapidly after the head had changed a few years ago. Katal asked if it could be used to verify his identity. The soldier replied that it did not look like a fake, but it was difficult to verify since it was from another kingdom. Taking the brooch, the soldier said that this could not be confirmed, but this time it would do, and Katal would be able to pass, but only on one condition. The blonde immediately opened his eyes wide in surprise and asked again in bewilderment. The soldier then leaned over and said they needed to confirm that Katal was not a threat. 3 more were trying to enter the territory at that very moment. The condition was to clear the border dungeon along with those whose identities were still unknown. Katal rubbed his chin thoughtfully in response and said that everything was simpler than he expected. Smiling brightly and pressing his hand to his chest, Katal exclaimed that he agreed. The soldier said that after clearing the dungeon, they would have to report on everything that happened inside. Katal said those whose status is unclear should keep an eye on each other and in the process, identify suspicious ones. The soldier said that this was not entirely true, and then he asked if it was true that Katal was a barbarian. The blonde grinned brightly in response and folded his arms across his chest, saying that it was true. In response, the man's eyes widened because he had previously thought that barbarians were simply savages. The soldier said that Katal was the first such barbarian he had ever met, and then suggested that they get down to business. The man with the mustache asked whether, even if this was the law, he would have to go into the dungeon with the robbers and thieves. Alessandro Tyrannus is a self-proclaimed paladin who said it was beneath him. The thief Conhair asked why the old man was picking a fight again. Was Alessandro angry because he had been robbed once? Alessandro exclaimed, asking how a petty thief dared insult a paladin. Cain chuckled and said that a real paladin would never have gotten to them, and Tyrannus was just a wandering mercenary, and he was pretending to be someone unknown. The long-haired brunette said that Alessandro was as much of a scumbag as he was, but he only got angrier. Cain asked what kind of idiotic name Tyrannus was, but he had already managed to pull his sword out of its sheath. Alessandro suddenly pulled the weapon forward and cried out loudly in anger, turning to the thief. Cain chuckled and took out a dagger, mockingly asking if he really wanted to fight. The brunette smiled, pulling out a dagger and asking if Alessandro really thought that the battered armor would protect him. In response, Alessandro squeezed the hilt of his sword even tighter, already preparing to fight the young man. But when the men clashed, a young girl approached them and asked them to stop. Priestess Colosia Hayes wondered if she would survive in the dungeon with such companions. Colosia thought that the minimum number for going into the dungeon was 4, which meant that someone else had to join them. Then the priestess turned around and awkwardly pressed her fist to her mouth as if she were thinking again. And just a few moments later, the girl suddenly heard heavy steps behind the wall. The soldier exclaimed that the last man had arrived. Kasan said he hoped at least this one was normal, and the soldier advised him to see for himself when he let the barbarian in. In the darkness, the blonde's eyes blazed with an evil fire as he slowly walked towards them. The blonde bent down to pass through the doorway, and the rest of those present recoiled in surprise. But then the guy smiled good-naturedly and asked if those were really his partners. Alessandro continued to look tensely at the man, whom he considered a giant. The priestess looked at him with fear, only hoping that the person in front of her really was a man. Cain's heart clenched his teeth, thinking that the blonde was overwhelming with his mere presence. But then Katal smiled good-naturedly and waved, saying he was glad to meet them. The soldier said from behind the door that they could talk to each other and that he would return soon. Katal continued to smile kindly, extending his hand to them and introducing himself. Then the blonde's eyes widened and he turned to Kasan, who was standing next to him, asking his name. Alessandro introduced himself by looking down and calling himself a paladin. The barbarian asked if he could use holy power. Alessandro awkwardly replied that paladins usually use it, but he is quite special and does not know how. Katal responded in surprise that he understands everything. The priestess of Hayes, Colosia, who serves the god of lies and deceit, also introduced herself. Katal replied that he was pleased to meet her. The blonde asked in surprise if even priestesses had to prove their identity. Colosia looked away awkwardly, saying that she served the god of lies and deceit, so naturally he was not particularly respected. And finally, after some time, a military man came to them and those present fell silent. The soldier addressed them, saying that if everyone was ready, then it was time for them to move out. In response, everyone present fell silent, only the blonde looked at the soldier with curiosity. The priestess looked sadly at the soldier, and Cain only exhaled heavily, watching what was happening. After some time, the soldier finally exclaimed that they had arrived at their destination. The blonde began to examine the area in response and then exhaled in surprise. The soldier led them to the entrance to the dungeon, which was hidden by tree crowns. The soldier insisted that the dungeon was 3 stories high and the monsters were undead. The blonde smiled as the soldier ordered them to clear the dungeon and return with the trophy as proof. The thief addressed Katal as Sir, but Katal asked him not to call him that since they were a team. Then Katal scratched his chin awkwardly and addressed him again in an awkward voice. Kasan said, already imagining the carnage, that Katal and the warrior would take the front line and he would check the traps. The thief raised his finger to the sky and said that his sister would support them from behind with her abilities. Katal immediately hit his fist into his palm and said that he understood everything, and Cain laughed awkwardly in response. Then the blonde smiled brightly and looked into the dungeon, saying that it was time for them to move out then. Then the man walked into the dungeon, looking around the entire room with curiosity. The others were tense. Suddenly, a small elevation appeared in front of them, illuminated by a bright light. The priestess looked around in fear, realizing that because of the darkness she could not see anything. Kasan thought that there weren't even any ordinary traps or tricks. It looked suspiciously ordinary. And then the man turned around abruptly, his eyes wide with fear, and he staggered. Grabbing Katal by the shoulder, the thief asked him to wait because there were monsters there. The barbarian replied that he saw nothing. Kasan pointed to the scattered bones on the floor, saying that they were skeletons that would stand up and attack if approached. Kasan realized that his suspicions were confirmed, and the captain of the guard knew everything from the very beginning. And this dungeon was originally a way to get rid of strangers. The blonde thoughtfully rubbed his chin with his hands, saying that these were indeed skeletons. Kasan said that skeletons are strong monsters that continue to move even if their limbs are cut off. The skeleton's eyes would suddenly glow brightly with a blue flame when it began to attack. Kasan said that skeletons were stronger than normal corpses. Katal replied that they were harder to deal with than he thought. Kasan then took notice of the skeleton's attack and ordered his sister to prepare her forces. Turning to Alessandro, the thief ordered him to raise his shield, saying that Katal must prepare himself. He insisted that he would try to find a moment to attack during the battle. Kasan said that the skeleton's body moves even when it is damaged, so you need to hit the neck several times, since that is their weak point. Katal listened attentively to all of Kasan's advice, then nodded and headed towards the skeleton. At the same time, a smiling monster rose from the ground, looking at the barbarian with curiosity. The blonde stopped for a moment and exhaled in surprise, looking at the revived skeleton. Then the skeleton began to smile even brighter, lifting a huge sword from the ground and sparkling with his eyes. The self-proclaimed paladin immediately raised his shield and looked at the monster with fear, trying to maintain his defense. Colossia clasped her hands in prayer and began to whisper words in a language incomprehensible to people, and flames appeared around her. And Kasan watched what was happening carefully, already holding a huge knife at the ready. But the barbarian decided to attack with his bare hands, and so he swung his palm at the skeleton. And just a moment later, the skeleton's body was overturned, immersed in the blue energy of Katal. And then the blonde struck the skeleton's head, causing it to shatter into pieces in seconds. But Katal himself was surprised by the strength of his blow, looking in surprise at the remains of the skeleton. Then the blonde slowly walked closer, and glowing dust was visible under his feet. Alessandro almost dropped his shield in surprise, his mouth wide open in surprise and his eyes wide open. Kasan and the priestess were also very surprised when they looked at the ashen barbarian in front of them. Then the blonde smiled brightly and exhaled joyfully, still not taking his eyes off the ashes of the skeleton. Katal turned around and said cordially that it was as Kasan had said. The skeleton really did stop moving if you cut off its head. Kasan laughed awkwardly, still looking at the barbarian with fear and wondering if that was what he had meant. The skeleton's bones are extremely hard. Even for an experienced swordsman, simply breaking a bone with one blow is almost impossible without the use of an aura. In addition, the dungeon feeds the skeleton mana, which makes it even stronger. The only way to defeat a skeleton is like chopping down a tree. You have to hit the neck repeatedly to sever the vertebrae. Simply severing the neck is nearly impossible. Kasan knew from the beginning that Katal was very strong, but he didn't realize the extent of it. Kasan continued to watch the barbarian, wondering if he really was a human being. The others present were thinking the same thing, but Katal ignored their sidelong glances and turned away. But then Katal smiled brightly and kindly, saying that it was now time for them to move on. The priestess, who had been frozen in bewilderment until then, suddenly rushed towards him and exclaimed that she was already running. The others also ran to him, and Katal said that there was no need to hurry. The others thought that they simply did not want to die. But for some reason, the Ash Barbarian's gaze fell on the skull that lay under his feet. The barbarian looked at him with curiosity, frozen, and Kasan turned to him in bewilderment. Before the barbarian's eyes, two skeletons began to rise, continuing to smile nastily. The girl recoiled in fear and exclaimed in a trembling voice that these were skeletons. Kasan also looked at the bodies of the rising skeletons with fear and anger. The paladin was more collected this time and decided to immediately raise his shield to defend himself. But suddenly Katal turned to them and asked for a favor. They froze in fear, listening to him. Katal said he would deal with the skeletons himself as he wanted to check something. Everyone immediately agreed, telling him to do whatever he wanted. At that moment, the guy's good-natured look changed dramatically and became distraught. But he still thanked his team. The Ash Barbarian watched as the skeleton slowly lifted the glowing sword from the ground. The whole team watched excitedly, not understanding what he was going to do. But the barbarian smiled brightly again and asked with curiosity how everything was arranged among the skeletons. But the skeleton cut him off abruptly, swinging his sword to attack and sighing heavily. But it was not difficult for the barbarian to stop the skeleton's sword with just 2 fingers squeezing it. The man then suddenly broke the sword into 2 pieces, asking what the skeleton was going to do with it. And the skeleton only grinned nastily in response and swung the remains of his sword again. And then a strange metal thing seemed to fly out of some stone. But the skeleton didn't pay attention to this, only swinging again to attack the motionless guy. The skeleton then tried to hit the barbarian on his shoulder, and he only looked at the blade in surprise, staggering. And then the blonde suddenly grabbed the skeleton's hand, causing him to freeze in place. And then the man's gaze became joyful when he looked at the skeleton's frightened face. Having torn off the skeleton's hand, Katal asked what his opponent was going to do now. And then the man turned his surprised gaze to his palm, on which there was shimmering dust. The skeleton stared at his hand in surprise for a moment, even frozen by what had happened. But the skeleton had no intention of giving in to this, and so he only grinned nastily, casting a fiery glance at the barbarian. And just a moment later, the monster suddenly jumped into the air, preparing to attack again. And then the smiling skeleton had his sword back in his hands, which he grabbed in his other hand. The man smiled happily in response and asked if the skeleton could really change its hand. But the monster again ignored him and suddenly attacked the enemy with a sword. But the man managed to stop him again with ease, grabbing his wrist and forcing him to drop his sword. The guy tore off the skeleton's second hand and then watched indifferently as the monster's body fell to the ground. But the monster's confusion did not last long, because after a couple of moments, he stood up from the ground. And then the skeleton grinned nastily again and suddenly pounced on the barbarian, watching him. The skeleton was about to strike the barbarian with the remains of his hand, but he didn't even think of resisting. The man broke the skeleton's bone again with one blow, happily saying that it could replace body parts for itself, so its intelligence was quite high. After some time, the priestess began to tremble in fear and horror, covering her mouth with her hand. Alessandro and Casal also trembled with fear and tried to recoil, watching what was happening. After breaking the skeleton's bones once more, Katal sat him on his knees and smiled madly. Alessandro said that this was the strength of a true barbarian. The ash barbarian's eyes glowed brightly with purple flames as he swung his sword to attack. At the same time, Casal could only watch Katal in fear, almost trembling. But after just a few moments, the skeleton's skull finally appeared on the ground, sparkling with blue energy. The man continued to stare at the skeleton's body in disbelief, frowning deeply and barely smiling. Stepping on the skeleton's skull, the blonde muttered that if he removed the head, the monster's body would not move. Saying it was funny, Katal smiled good-naturedly and apologized for the wait. Casal immediately recoiled in fear and exclaimed that this was not so at all, and that Katal should take his time. Katal responded with a confused thank you and took a couple of steps forward, turning around. Smiling brightly, Katal suggested that they move on, and everyone immediately agreed with fear. After some time, the ash barbarian suddenly stopped, freezing in place. Katal looked at something in front of him with curiosity, while Casal opened his eyes in surprise. Then Casal replied, looking at the stairs leading down, that this was the passage to the second floor. Alessandro walked behind Katal and also carefully examined every corner of the dungeon. The priestess walked with her hand pressed to her chest, looking fearfully and tensely at what was happening around her. After some time of their walk up the stairs, Casal suddenly lifted his collar and sighed heavily. Kassan asked hesitantly if perhaps they should all get some rest. Katal immediately turned around and put his finger to his chin, saying that it would indeed be better this way. And Casal immediately stood at attention, loudly thanking the ashen barbarian. After some time, the blonde also managed to relax, closing his eyes and folding his arms across his chest. The rest of those present followed his example, sitting down on the cold ground. But Katal woke them all up, saying that he had a question about this dungeon. The barbarian looked away in confusion and smiled, saying that he was embarrassed, but his knowledge on this issue was insufficient. The priestess exclaimed that the pursuit of knowledge is a virtue, and then asked what Katal wanted to know. Then Katal thoughtfully said that this dungeon was located quite close to the border. Pressing his hand to his chin, the barbarian asked if the population had any problems with monsters. The priestess said that usually monsters from the dungeon do not come out, although there are exceptions, but usually they are decided in advance. Casal closed his eyes for a moment and then coughed slightly, drawing attention to himself. Brunette said that the dungeons were a natural phenomenon. Most often they were full of plants, and the buildings in them were ancient. Casal kept saying that sometimes dungeons appear as caves and sometimes as towers. Looking down, Casal said that most dungeons appeared near densely populated areas. Katal raised his studying gaze to the ceiling of the dungeon, muttering that was why it appeared there. The priestess said that when a dungeon appears, the local lord assesses the level of danger. Then, either outsiders like them or mercenaries or guards are sent to clean it up. But in response, the blonde grinned for some reason and nevertheless decided to turn around, looking at his comrades. Katal asked if the dungeons appeared inside the territory. The priestess answered that they always appeared at a certain distance. The blonde clenched his fists joyfully and asked if there was a reward for successfully completing the task. The priestess said that this was true, adding that there was a boss on the last floor, defeating which gave different rewards. Colossia thought for a moment and said that for a dungeon of this size, the reward should be significant. And in response, the barbarian smiled brightly and muttered that everything here was just like in a game. Colossia looked at the barbarian in surprise and asked again. He replied that it was just thinking out loud. But the blonde had one more question. The priestess, hearing this, said that he could ask. Katal asked who was creating these dungeons, and the priestess froze for a moment, then asked again in bewilderment. The priestess replied in confusion that dungeons arise naturally, no one creates them. Katal replied that there were too many oddities for that, since firstly they appeared near large cities. Katal said that the dungeons seemed to be begging to be explored, thinking that they appeared near settlements, tempting people with treasures. Katal folded his arms across his chest, saying that it seemed too reasonable for a natural phenomenon. Colossia thought for a few seconds and then said that Katal was indeed right. The girl looked down and thought that it was so self-evident that she didn't even think to question it. Kasan also realized that he had never even doubted this, because it was simply the natural order. So was the barbarian really questioning the truth itself? Kasan looked down and thought that the barbarians were, by all accounts, an ignorant and savage people. Kasan recalled that they were cruel creatures, deprived of blood and tears, and Katal must have been the same. But now, looking at Katal, he couldn't understand whether he really was a typical barbarian. But then Katal's voice came into his ear and said that this was all very interesting. Katal waved his hand, smiled good-naturedly, and asked if they had rested enough. All those present immediately rose from the ground and excitedly said that everything was now in order. Katal waved his hand and stood up from the ground, happily saying that it was time for them to move on then. Then the companions set off again, carefully examining every wall of the dungeon. All those present followed the barbarian, looking around in fear, not letting go of their weapons. But suddenly the blonde opened his eyes wide and stopped abruptly, looking at the floor. Before the blonde's eyes appeared a chest, next to which lay a small weapon. He asked what it was. Castle replied that the treasure chest was one of the rewards of the labyrinth, so if Katal could open it, it would be his. Casal knew it would take a master locksmith with proven skills to open a chest of this quality. Casal knew that a rogue of his level had no business in such a dungeon, so they would have to leave empty-handed. Then the blonde suddenly turned to Casal and asked him to open the chest, and Casal in response stared at him in bewilderment. Katal glanced at the lock reward again, reminding himself that it was a treasure chest. Then the blonde said that Casal was a bandit. He tried to awkwardly justify himself and refuse. Katal excitedly asked if the robber should not be dealing with the chests. He was glad to see the rogue's skills up close. The brunette then tiredly closed his eyes and thought that Katal was not mistaken, but there was one problem. The guy smiled good-naturedly, thinking that if he could really do it, he wouldn't have found himself in this situation. Casal wanted to scream that he was a loser, whom even the guild would not recognize because he didn't even know how to pick locks. Casal stood frozen for a moment, like a statue, realizing that he couldn't tell Katal the truth. Looking at the welcoming Katal, Kasan realized that he had such high hopes for him, but upon hearing the truth, he would be disappointed. He imagined Katal's stern face asking why Casal called himself a thief, but couldn't even do that. The barbarian would say he was useless. The brunette really wanted to scream from the hopelessness of the situation, but for now he just froze. Then the brunette scratched his head awkwardly and laughed, thoughtfully saying that he would, of course, try. Katal watched Casal's actions closely, marveling at the equipment for picking locks. The brunette thought that if he failed this attempt, he would not get out alive. Casal simply prayed to himself to remember all those skills he had seen while working as a porter for the thieves. While Casal was trying to open the lock, Katal was almost burning his back with his gaze, absorbing every action. One of the participants in the raid would have been electrocuted. Katal looked at his partner with bewilderment in his eyes, and the man, wiping away his tears, said that he had finally managed to open something. All this time he was trying to open the treasure chest, but only now it gave in. The girl in the nun's robe was delighted and said that she could not believe it, since usually only experienced thieves could open the treasures. Katal said it was seriously impressive and praised Kasan. It seemed impossible, but he managed it by simply assessing the situation. Kasan, who had always prided himself on trying to live his best, began to doubt his better self for the first time in his life. When Katal asked about the price of the treasure, the nun replied that an ordinary family could live for about a month on that amount. As soon as these words were spoken, a smile blossomed on Katal's face. Then he turned to Kasan and asked him to take care of the reward. The young man approached the chest and took out something that looked like a silver cup. He looked at his trophy with a mesmerized gaze when Katal called out to him. Then he became frightened and threw the cup back into the chest, screaming loudly. After some time, people finally came out of the cave in which they found the treasure. Kasan was carrying a heavy sack and Katal was walking in front of the entire procession. They noticed the skeletons lying on the ground and stopped in front of them. Looks like there were only 4 of them here. Someone volunteered to deal with 3. But then something happened that made everyone freeze. Katal, his eyes shining, said that the last one should be left to him. The young man thought that this barbarian was truly frightening, and the man in armor and the nun agreed and said that the last skeleton would be his care. They continued moving forward, approaching the remains lying on the floor. The skeleton's eyes glowed an ominous blue, indicating that they were about to awaken. Kasan thought that the gathering skeletons gave him goosebumps. The skeletons continued to gather together, bone by bone, and then they finally stood up on their feet. They began to approach the group of people, their mouths wide open in threatening smiles. The man in armor took a fighting stance and was ready to face the battle. The nun began casting a defensive spell, strengthening all of her teammates. Kasan looked at the danger in front of him with a look full of confidence. The fight was just beginning. The skeletons continued to advance menacingly. They were immediately faced with strong blows that their comrades dealt them. But the fire in their empty eye sockets never went out, which made the monsters look even more terrifying. At some point, one of them was suddenly grabbed by someone's strong hands. Katal held the skeletons back and said that this was a rare sight, so it was better for the skeletons not to interfere. One of the skeletons pulled out a weapon from somewhere and started waving it. He launched attacks at the male knight, who was hiding behind his shield. The knight maintained his defense against the skeleton and did not succumb to its attacks. At the same time, Kasan jumped up and swung his weapon at the skeleton. He struck him with a strong chopping motion of his sword and landed on his feet. The nun's eyes turned a light amber color as she began to chant some new spell. The girl strengthened that same knight, who at that very second rushed into the attack with renewed vigor. The man ran forward, leaving behind a trail of light from his weapon. The skeletons fell to the ground one after another, hitting their bony knees and raising dust. One of the skeletons seemed to give up and decided to stop fighting, but the next second, something unexpected happened. He stood up, his eyes glowing with blue lights, and the skeleton itself looked menacing. As soon as all this happened, Katal began to smile even wider again. He said it was all really impressive. He enjoyed watching the team's skills work together. He said it was a rare sight to see such a well-coordinated team. Meanwhile, Kazan was already dealing the next blow to the poor skeletons. After analyzing the situation, Katal said that there were no more obstacles, so it was time to enjoy the show. Kasan continued to hit skeletons left and right, swinging his sword. The same thought about Katal flashed through everyone's minds. The nun also stared at Katal and thought that this barbarian was testing them all. The knight also looked at the barbarian with a slightly angry expression. At some point, the skeleton's eyes filled with true fear. He stood frozen in his stance with his pocket knife and looked at the approaching people with horror. And 3 fighters covered in magical energy were flying straight towards him. The poor monster didn't even have a chance to escape. If he showed any weakness, he would die immediately. The sound of swords hitting bones rang out, and streaks of magic cut through the air. It was clear that it was not possible for the skeleton to survive, since after just a few minutes, its skull was lying separately from the talus on the ground. To be fair, during the entire battle, the squad of warriors also became exhausted. Now all 3 were sitting on the ground in the dungeon and catching their breath. Katal remembered those people who came from the snowy wasteland and the mercenaries. He thought he had to give them credit because they really were very strong. There were more skeletons from the 3rd level of the dungeon, but with Katal at the head, the squad continued moving without any problems. As soon as people noticed danger, the barbarian dealt with it in the blink of an eye. And finally, everyone reached the lower level and froze in anticipation of something. Kasan looked ahead and tried to assess the situation and what he saw in front of him. It was the deepest part of the dungeon, where someone was sitting on a raised throne. It seemed as if the man on the throne had been dead for a long time, as he did not move at all. It was a skeleton knight, whose appearance surprised everyone. Katal said that this skeleton was different from all the others they had encountered along the way. According to the nun, he was indeed very strong. This skeleton could freely wield a sword. She thought that if he was really a knight level, then they wouldn't be able to deal with the danger. Katal asked what would happen if they retreated, and the girl replied that they would need confirmation from the territory. Hearing this, Katal grinned, as if he was planning something. He stepped forward and began to walk towards the skeleton, to the general cheers of his team. The skeleton knight's eyes lit up with red lights, indicating his high level. The skeleton knight woke up completely, ready to attack the company that decided to conquer the dungeon. He stood near his throne, clutching a sword in his hand, and Katal approached him. The man said he found it very interesting that the skeleton could maintain its shape. At this time, the skeleton had already begun to swing its sword at him, gathering an evil aura around the weapon. The nun's eyes suddenly widened as if she saw something that was dangerous. She covered herself and her teammates with a shield while shouting for everyone to stay safe. But under the onslaught of the skeleton's attacks, her shield didn't seem as strong as before. With each passing second, it became more and more difficult for her to maintain this barrier. And finally, it began to crack at the seams under the onslaught of another skeleton attack. The barrier collapsed, shattering into pieces as if it were made of glass. But everyone present remained alive and well, only the knight's shield was fried. Katal turned around and looked at his partners, as if noticing something. The knight at this time tried to come to terms with the fact that this opponent's blows were so destructive. In his humble opinion, this skeleton was too strong. But they had no luck waking him up, so now all they could do was accept the consequences. The skeleton knight charged towards the squad for another attack, trailing a trail of menacing magic behind him. Katal stood right in front of the skeleton, abstracted from the others and thinking about something of his own. As the skeleton approached him at a dangerous distance, the man's eyes widened and he stared at it. The next second, the annoying opponent was sent flying by a powerful punch from Katal. The skeleton's armor broke into hundreds of small pieces and he himself hit the ground. Kasan stared at what had just happened as if a miracle had just happened right in front of his nose. The facial expressions of the others present were equally eloquent. The barbarian shook the dust off his hands, clapping his gloves together. He looked at his squad and asked if that was all for today. A deathly silence fell over the dungeon because after such a feat by the barbarian, no one dared to even hiss. The man looked towards Kasan and tried to think of what to say to him. The young man, a little frightened by the barbarian's strength, turned to him and answered. A sparkling chest appeared in front of them, which was given for killing the boss monster. Katal asked Kasan to open the chest, but he said it was impossible because it had a high-level lock. Upon hearing this answer, Katal said he was sorry, to which Kasan replied that they would have to leave the chest. But before he could finish speaking, the barbarian struck the chest with all his might and broke it. Kasan's eyes widened as he saw how skillfully his partner had just broken the treasures. A broken chest full of silver coins appeared in front of Katal and the group. The nun and the knight were shocked by how the barbarian had just gotten the reward. And Katal said that the reward was definitely easier to obtain this way. No one could have imagined that Katal would just go and break the chest. But Kasan seriously thought about the fact that if Katal could break the chest, then why did he ask him to open the treasures? After some time, they all came out of the dungeon. It was a clear day outside, and the sun was shining, which created a sharp contrast to the dungeon. Katal heard strange whispers from his comrades and asked what had happened. But something was approaching them from behind his back. It turned out that if the dungeon was completely completed, it disappeared. That's why the dungeon was collapsing behind them now. Kasan mentioned about the secret room, and Katal became interested in it. He smiled and said that it was indeed interesting, still not believing that such things existed. Kasan looked at his comrade as if he were retarded, and could not understand why he had never heard of secret rooms. When they arrived at their destination, the knight stood up from the table and was surprised that they finished everything so quickly. The city's fence was quite high, and there was not a single patrolman on the walls now. The man turned to Katal and his team and asked how they were enjoying the dungeon. Katal replied with a big smile on his face that it was really cool. Upon receiving the answer, the knight said that he would begin the entry procedure, asking them to enter one by one. The nun looked at the knight, interrogating her, and said that there were no serious problems. The knight, with folded arms, asked if she thought it was acceptable to leave the barbarian in the domain. The girl asked if this was not normal, and the knight noticed that the nun immediately fell silent when the conversation turned to the barbarian. The entry procedure was not just a dungeon crawl, as the real goal was to identify potentially dangerous individuals. During interrogation, Kasan looked away and said that the barbarian did not seem problematic. Then the interrogation of the third team member began, who had to dot the I's and cross the T's. According to the guard, the barbarian did not harm the team, so he did not look like an ordinary barbarian. During his interrogation, Katal began to praise each of the participants in the raid. The guard thought this was unusual, as usually when strangers were brought together for the sake of a dungeon, they rarely spoke well of each other. Sweat appeared on the knight's face when it was time to voice the final decision. Eventually, permission to enter was granted, but on the condition that no one would create problems. They were also given a reward for the dungeon, so that they could divide it among themselves. Usually the guards confiscated such awards, but this time they really didn't want to do that. Katal looked at his comrades and suggested that they share the reward fairly. They all started to refuse, intending to accept as much money as Katal would give them. But the man said that they were one team, so the reward should be divided fairly. The barbarian then suggested that they all celebrate their entry into the domain and was going to find a pub nearby. All three were perplexed when he suggested celebrating because everyone was tired. There was a strange expression on their faces and a silent request to just let them go quickly. But the barbarian was already running into the pub, while the knight watched his retreating silhouette and thought about how he knocked down the skeleton knight with one blow. In his opinion, this barbarian was monstrously strong, no less than a knight. In his opinion, this man was not an ordinary barbarian, but the most legendary barbarian, an alien creature. The guard turned around on the spot as if he had thought of something that required decisive and quick action. He told his subordinate that he was going to the Lord and leaving him at his post. Evening descended on the city, and then many stars appeared in the night sky. On the table in the castle's office lay a freshly written letter with still fresh ink. Hearing a light knock on the door, the man ordered the guest to enter. It was a guard who had come to report to the Lord and was ready to give his account right away. Lord Luke Barkin looked at the knight and asked him what had happened. The guard said that a barbarian had appeared in their domain, while maintaining a terrifying expression on his face. This meeting took place behind closed doors, and the Lord even had to call away the servants so as not to frighten them. The man asked the guard if he had given him permission, to which the knight replied that he had decided that this would not create any serious problems. The Lord looked at him in bewilderment and asked, "What was the matter then?" Hearing this question, the guard said that the barbarian was too strong. So strong that it could become a problem. The Lord looked at him with a more serious expression on his face and asked how strong the barbarian was. The guard said he had been told of Katal killing a skeleton knight with one blow. The Lord looked at him in disbelief and imagined a skeleton knight in his head to make sure he wasn't mistaken. The skeleton knight was a monster that no one below the level of a knight should be able to handle, but now some barbarian had defeated him. In the Lord's mind, barbarians were ignorant creatures who decided everything with brute force. He asked again if the knight really meant to say that this barbarian was first class, to which he replied that there was a high probability of this, although perhaps he was even stronger. The knight could not rule out the possibility that he did not know something about the barbarian. A warrior of that level, and a barbarian at that, could be a problem, especially if he believed that strength gave him the right to do everything. The Lord asked that the barbarian be summoned to him personally, after which the knight asked about the wisdom of such a decision. The Lord said that the presence of such a strong man was itself a source of instability, so he needed to see Katal in person. After the guard said that it could be dangerous, the Lord said that he had his own knight, and the guard immediately looked behind the Lord, where his special knight for special purposes was already standing. The Lord turned to the knight and asked him what his opinion was on all this. He said that he might have power, but he was just a barbarian, a boor without a drop of intelligence or knowledge. The man said that compared to his swordsmanship, which he had been taught by a great swordsman, the barbarian was nothing. The Lord thought about it again and bowed his head. Now he was absolutely sure of his decision, and asked once again to call the barbarian to him for a personal conversation. Meanwhile, Katal and his new company were sitting in one of the pubs. The barbarian didn't often eat something tasty, so now he was wolfing down the food. The other three comrades looked at him with strange expressions on their faces. They all looked horrified as Katal devoured leg after leg and asked for more. Then he lifted his glass of beer and took a sip. He said it was delicious, and he liked the atmosphere, and reminded them that he was treating everyone so they could eat as much as they wanted in peace. The nun laughed a little nervously since after such a mission she couldn't swallow a bite. Katal turned to the knight and asked him if he was a holy knight. He was curious about what kind of power this knight used, since he hadn't seen him use it in the dungeon. The man seemed a little ashamed and replied that he was still learning, so his power had not yet awakened. Katal said he was sorry to hear that, and he didn't mean to hurt anyone's feelings. The barbarian again tried to get his comrades to talk and turned to the nun, asking her if there was a temple nearby. She replied that her goddess was not usually particularly welcomed, so there was probably no temple nearby. Colossia, after all, was the goddess of lies and deceit, rejected and banished by the majority. She then turned to Katal, getting his attention. The girl asked the question that everyone present wanted to ask, but did not dare. She asked how strong he was, and everyone immediately pricked up their ears and prepared for possible danger. Katal looked pleased with this question as his expression did not change. He said that if we talk about rank, he had recently left the snow wasteland, so he was also curious. The nun said that to fight a skeleton knight, one must be at least second rank, and a first-class warrior could probably defeat Katal. Katal accepted the fact that he was the lucky owner of the second rank when someone approached them. This guest turned out to be the owner of the tavern, who was horrified by the sight of the barbarian and said that it was time for them to close. Katal stood up from his seat and asked for forgiveness with a smile, saying that it was time for them all to go too. The guys left the pub and Katal asked his comrades if they all had their own plans and things to do. Seeing this as the best opportunity to go home very quickly, everyone said that they all had plans. Kasan was the busiest of them, apparently, as he was shouting about how busy they were as loud as he could. Katal said that he was even a little sad to say goodbye to everyone and told everyone until the next meeting. The three comrades thought that it would be good if they never met again. Eventually, Katal reached some inn and finally lay down on the bed. It was the first time he had laid in bed since he came into this world. He was lucky that he was able to afford a room thanks to the dungeon reward. Compared to the wasteland, this place was heaven on earth, and this bed was a soft cloud. It had taken him a long time to get back to civilization since he had woken up there. But now he didn't know what to do next. Katal decided that he now wanted adventure. He remembered the sacred lands of the elves, the Tower of Magic, and the royal capital, and then his eyes closed automatically and he fell into a deep sleep, finally giving his body a chance to rest. In the morning, the sun began to break through the closed wooden windows with its rays. Katal woke up feeling like he had finally had a good night's sleep under a warm blanket and a soft bed. He rose to a sitting position and heard a knock on the door, which woke him up completely. As soon as the door was opened, a guard appeared on the threshold, asking for forgiveness for getting up so early. Katal recognized the same captain of the guard from yesterday and asked him what had happened. He didn't know how to present this information more gently, so he cleared his throat. And then the guard loudly announced that the lord of this place wanted to see the barbarian in person. Katal thought that the lord of this territory was the owner of this land, and it was strange that he wanted to meet him. But still, there was no need to consider it as something bad. So Katal smiled and said that everything was fine. He asked if he needed to go out right now, and then said that he would now grab his clothes and be ready to go. The sun had already risen high above the horizon, and the street was gradually filling up with people. When Katal first entered this area, it was just a slum, so he only had a quick look at the city. But now, seeing everything during the day, it seemed like a completely different matter. Katal walked and smiled, not believing his happiness and the fact that he could now walk around the city like this. If this was a successful fantasy, then he was ready to happily accept it at any moment. The guard walked in front of the barbarian and thought about the fact that time was short, so he needed to block as many lines of sight as possible. After several dozen minutes, the two finally reached the Lord's palace. The Lord looked at the guard and ordered him and the barbarian to enter the office. Katal appeared on the threshold of a luxurious room in the Lord's luxurious mansion. Luke Barkin extended his hand in greeting and said that he was very pleased to meet the barbarian. The man introduced himself and once again reminded that he was the lord of this territory. The barbarian shook his hand and said that he, too, was glad to meet him. He bowed his head in respect and introduced himself in the same manner as the lord. For a moment, the lord stood frozen in place, as he could not believe how good this barbarian's manners were. He looked at his guest with wide-open eyes and an expression of complete contradiction, as if his prejudices had been finally shattered. The man was shocked that this barbarian bowed to him, which meant that he possessed some kind of intelligence which was not typical of his comrades. Barbarians never bowed, for them strength was everything. But it seems that if you live long enough, you will see everything. The Lord closed his eyes and said that it seemed that Katal had been taught manners and invited him to sit down. Katal sat down on a chair. The Lord sat opposite him at the other end of the table, and next to him, all this time, stood his personal knight. The room they were in really did look luxurious in Katal's opinion. It really did look like the real Lord's castle he had imagined in his past life. Even in the fantasy world, the castles were like in the Middle Ages. Then his gaze fell on the knight standing next to the Lord, and Katal immediately realized that it was his personal guard. As a child, he often played knights and didn't think he would see a real one, but apparently now it was his reality. The knight noticed the admiration with which this strange barbarian was looking at him and immediately glanced sideways at him. He looked at the man with murderous intent in his eyes, ready to tear him apart. There was definitely a bloodlust in his eyes, which was a little strange for a knight. But the knight also misunderstood the barbarian's intentions, thinking that he was aggressive. He reached for the sword at his waist and thought that Katal would not leave here alive. But the knight's intention to kill this stranger was abruptly cut short by the Lord's harsh words. The Lord said that he wanted to clear up some issues with this barbarian, so he called him here. Katal crossed his arms over his chest and said he was ready to talk, so the Lord could ask him whatever he wanted. The Lord's voice seemed a little shaky as he spoke, and then he asked where Katal had come from. The man began to tell his life story again, saying that he came from the coldest place in this world. As soon as he said that he came from a world covered in frost, fear flashed in the eyes of the guard knight. The Lord also seemed to be a little scared, thinking that the only correct answer was that the barbarian came from the white, snowy wasteland. Now everyone was sure that this was the legendary barbarian in front of them. The Lord looked away and said that Katal was saying things that were hard to believe. The barbarian exhaled and said that it was a terrible place, and whether to believe it or not, the Lord must decide for himself. Realizing that he would not get any more information, the Lord decided to ask another question. And that question was how strong this barbarian was. It was important for the Lord now to understand how dangerous this barbarian's power was. Katal replied that this question was wrong because he did not know the local power system. The horde looked at his knight as if telling him something without words. The knight nodded to him, agreeing to the Lord's silent proposal. The landowner offered Katal a duel with his knight to determine the level of his strength. Katalu was also promised a worthy reward for this. The Lord said that of course it was not a fight to the death, so he hoped that Katal would not cross the line. Hearing this, Katal smiled and said that he was satisfied with everything. He was even glad that he would be able to duel with a real knight, but the Lord was perplexed. This knight was clearly not a simple one. Believe it was a knight from a fantasy world, possessing mystical power and aura. Just the thought of being able to see this knight's technique up close made Katal smile. The Lord looked at Katal and saw everything completely differently because of the barbarian's frightening aura. In his opinion, a barbarian remained a barbarian no matter how politely he behaved, and he did not hide his thirst for battle at all. Both the knight and the Lord himself began to tremble slightly, as if they were beginning to fear this barbarian in front of them. At the Lord's palace, there was a structure somewhat reminiscent of the Colosseum. The Lord sat somewhere on the upper tier on a throne, while the knight and the barbarian descended into the arena below. They stood opposite each other, ready for battle. The knight looked at the barbarian with a serious expression on his face, and Katal looked at the knight with a smile of joy that he would finally be able to engage in a difficult duel. The Lord announced the start of the duel and said that he hoped there would be no bloodshed. He rang the bell next to him to signal the participants that the battle had begun. The knight said that the barbarian should consider it an honor to see his fencing skill. Katal smiled and said that he would like that too. This answer puzzled the knight, who thought that the barbarian was too calm. The knight took a stance and was ready to show Katal a stunning difference in strength. The man covered himself with a layer of magic and rushed to attack straight at the barbarian. Katal seemed to freeze in place as the knight considered what the barbarian would do. Suddenly, the knight pulled his sword out of its sheath in mid-flight and pointed it at the barbarian. Katal realized that he had to act right now, but he froze in place for a moment. Katal couldn't understand why he saw 3 swords instead of 1. Why this knight's sword suddenly split into 3? The thought flashed through Katal's mind that this was a simple illusion. He deftly dodged all of the knight's attacks and realized that it was not an illusion. He continued to dodge while thinking that all 3 swords were real, and this was what the knight called fencing. Watching Katal dodge attack after attack, the knight thought that his previous judgments had been correct. In his opinion, Katal was only capable of barely dodging his attacks. He supposed that this avoidance of attacks was impressive in itself, but he was starting to get tired of it. Suddenly, the barbarian stretched out his fist forward as if he was about to do something. He snapped his fingers and broke one of the swords into 2 pieces, simultaneously knocking the second one out of the knight's hands. The knight was perplexed by this turn of events. He never expected that his sword would be broken. At the same time, Katal finally knocked the weapon out of his hands and approached him. He grabbed the knight by his armor and crushed the metal beneath his fingers. The man then threw the knight into a free flight several dozen meters. The knight hit the ground and coughed up blood from his injuries. As soon as the Lord saw the outcome of the duel, he instantly froze in place. His knight lay on the ground, unable to rise simply because of 1 blow from the barbarian. There was a huge crack left on the ground where the knight had walked while flying into the wall. The Lord thought that a high-level knight had been defeated with just 1 blow. Now he was truly convinced of the monstrous strength of this barbarian. Katal, as if nothing had happened, turned around on the spot and looked towards the Lord. He looked straight at the landowner and asked if that was all the checks for today. The Lord was still somewhere in a daze, completely unable to understand how he had come to all this. The man stood on a hill, but even there he did not feel safe. He still had to agree that this was the end of the test. A barbarian who could defeat a high-level knight with one blow was a possessor of superhuman strength. But this was only the minimum, since the true depth of his power was impossible to estimate. And since such a person could shake the balance of the world, the Lord had to inform one of the few in this world who bears the title of Swordmaster. The Lord thought that this man was supposed to arrive soon, so it should interest him. Suddenly a voice was heard asking what would interest him. All the windows and doors in the office instantly found themselves wide open, and next to one of the windows stood a man who looked more like an elder of some cult. The Lord exhaled, as if this man who suddenly appeared had frightened him greatly. He looked at the newcomer again and said that his interests were still just as disgusting. The man said he needed to somehow entertain himself. Swordmaster Cain asked the Lord if he was going to tell him about a matter that might interest him. The Lord rose from his seat and walked towards the Swordmaster who had just arrived. He greeted Lord Cain properly and then decided to finish the formalities. Cain looked at the Lord like he was an idiot, wanting him to get down to business as soon as possible. All this time, the Lord was thinking about what he should say and how to even start this conversation. At this time, the knight was recovering from the recent battle. The door to the medical closet opened and someone was about to appear on the threshold. It was the Lord who asked how the knight was feeling. The knight suddenly rose up on his elbows in bed and said that he would feel better in a couple of days and that he asked for forgiveness. Another man appeared on the threshold and said that the knight needed to apologize to him because his stupid student was defeated by some nameless barbarian. Hearing a familiar voice, the knight recognized this newly arrived man as his master. The master's gaze fell on a huge hole in the knight's clothing in the chest area. There wasn't a single scratch on him. Judging by the state of his armor, the knight could have been dead already, but other than the torn clothes, the body was whole. The master said that a barbarian is not just a crazy savage, but someone who knows how to control power and does it with amazing precision. According to him, Katal was so superior to the knight that he could afford mercy. To everyone's surprise, the swordmaster came to the conclusion that the barbarian was a superman. The knight was also surprised when he heard such words from his mentor. The lord of the manor had nothing to say to this statement. He said that the next thing he said might sound quite rude. Lord Cain understood his comrade's train of thought and immediately replied that although the barbarian was strong, he was no match for the swordmaster. But the strange thing was that Katal didn't use aura, so his strength was even more surprising. According to him, it was impossible by normal means. He asked if this was the power of the barbarian from the White Wasteland. The Lord thought that at first he didn't believe it, but now the swordmaster himself said that this barbarian came from there. The swordmaster's eyes reflected a certain amount of interest in what was happening. This barbarian was a legendary figure surrounded by rumors. The swordmaster suggested that Katal might not be human at all. But then he rejected his own idea, shaking his head from side to side, driving the thoughts away. He said that if he were anyone else, he would not have spared the man, so the swordmaster was wrong. But he still didn't understand why this barbarian from the White Wasteland appeared right now. Noticing that the swordmaster was deep in thought, the Lord asked what was wrong. And his comrade answered him that this was a topic for another time, and then he mentioned the Emperor. The Emperor made strange requests and everyone in the Empire understood this. But the swordmaster said that they had nothing to worry about now. He also asked if that barbarian was currently in this domain, to which the Lord replied that everything was so, and the barbarian would indeed stay here. It seemed that their dialogue ended there because the swordmaster turned around and walked away. He left with a serious expression on his face, saying that he would have to see for himself. The bright sun was shining over the building. A man asked what the barbarian was going to do next. The guard looked tensely at the barbarian, who thoughtfully said that he didn't know yet. The memory of how he was given a reward for the duel in the form of coins flashed before the blonde's eyes. The king then said that from now on he would not interfere with Katal's activities in his territory. Katal said thoughtfully that he had no clear plans, but it would be nice if he had some official status. The guard said one option was to find a high-status patron to vouch for him or to become a mercenary. The guard said that if Katal earned a reputation and received recognition from the guild, his status could be officially recognized. The guard understood that if a mercenary had not reached a certain level, then he was essentially just an errand boy. And with the strength of a barbarian, it was wiser to find a patron. The blonde barely blushed and asked incredulously if it was true that one could obtain status by working as a mercenary. Katal thought that a mercenary is someone who takes orders for monsters, and this is the ultimate fantasy dream. Then the blonde smiled brightly and asked where he should go to become a mercenary. The guard looked at the barbarian in bewilderment and said that there was a guild building. The man smiled even brighter, saying that he would be grateful if the guard showed him the way. The guard continued to look at the smiling barbarian with bewilderment, agreeing in an absent-minded voice. Mercenaries are wanderers who take on any task. Some people think their life is romantic, but in reality, mercenaries without status are at the bottom of society. Even capable mercenaries often die trying to clear unknown dungeons and become cannon fodder for dirty work. Therefore, the lower class of mercenaries is dirt, shame, and constant fights. At the same time, a loud bang sounded in the mercenary building. A certain man pushed the mercenary away and screamed loudly at how he dared to approach him. But the man quickly came to his senses and exclaimed, asking if he really wanted to fight. Another one screamed even louder, exclaiming that the bastard might try to attack. The men next to them were betting on which of them would win, smiling and watching the proceedings. And then the two men attacked each other, almost tearing out hair and hitting each other. The pink-haired girl smiled and asked Rosa what was going on with the new recruits. The green-eyed blonde exhaled heavily and replied that they were all strange. The mercenary registrar said that the first madman pretended to be a holy knight, the second was a thief, and the nuns seemed normal, but because of her god, she was also not particularly trusted. The girl with short hair exhaled heavily again, and her partner said that they were out of luck. Rosa thought that there was not a single normal person. There were only stupid mercenaries who did nothing but fight all day. Rosa thought that it would be great if a handsome, brave prince on a white horse appeared and saved her from this office drudgery. And at that very moment, the door to the mercenary guild finally opened slightly, and the silhouette of a man appeared from it. Rosa's eyes immediately widened in surprise, freezing in place for a moment. Looking up, the girl met the blonde's gaze, and then became even more surprised. The barbarian smiled good-naturedly and looked around, muttering that this was the guild building. Even men who had recently been trying to pull out their hair suddenly stopped. The people around looked at Katal with surprise, surprised by the presence of a barbarian among them. The man didn't understand their sidelong glances, and so he just looked at the mercenaries in bewilderment and smiled. The blonde sat down at the table and said enthusiastically that he had come to become a mercenary. Rosa trembled and asked if Katal needed to be registered as a mercenary and why he wanted to become one. Katal said there were several reasons, but he heard it gave official status. Rosa said it would take some serious effort. After receiving a positive response, Rosa said that registration would cost 5 copper coins and then asked Katal's name and age. After introducing himself, the barbarian said he wasn't sure of his age. Rosa replied that she would simply give an approximate one. The girl then completed the registration and handed the guy a mercenary badge, which confirmed his status. The man froze for a moment in response, looking in surprise at the badge held out to him. Grabbing the gold keychain, the man smiled brightly and pressed it to his chest. The blonde enthusiastically asked what tasks there were, because he wanted to get to work right away. The blonde then handed him a small list of available tasks for Mr. Katal. But looking at the list, the guy froze for a moment, wondering if these were all the tasks. His tasks included collecting herbs, cleaning the basement and streets, cleaning the sewers, and night patrol. Rosa said in a trembling voice that since Katal was an F rank, these were his only tasks. She wondered what she would do if the barbarians suddenly went berserk. Looking down, Rosa exclaimed that if you start with something simple and gain experience, then over time, more serious tasks will open up. But the blonde interrupted her, saying that he would take one task. She looked at him in surprise. The man pointed his finger at the first herb gathering task, pointing it out to her. The girl asked Katal with a trembling voice if he was sure. He said it was the same job and he had no problem with it. Then the blonde smiled enthusiastically again and asked where to collect herbs. The girl showed a picture of a plant with a red flower, saying that they grow just outside the village. The man smiled excitedly and said that he would leave right now. The girl felt awkward. The girl looked after the guy in amazement, thinking that he was surprisingly calm. The blonde hurried out of the guild, leaving the mercenaries in bewilderment. Rosa continued to watch the place where Katal had previously stood in surprise when her frightened colleague approached her. After some time, a dense forest appeared before the guy's eyes, barely illuminated by the sky. But then the flowers that he had been asked to pick finally appeared before the blonde's eyes. Katal found many such plants in the clearing, but first decided to check the picture. Katal muttered that although these herbs were good for wounds, they still looked strange. Then the guy suddenly threw his fur cape on the ground, deciding it was time to get started. Katal put on his hat and took with him sun protection, saying it was time to do his first hired job. About an hour later, the man placed a whole bag of these red flowers on the guild table. Katal happily asked if that would be enough. Rosa replied in confusion that it was a lot, wondering if this was really a criminal genius who had come to destroy the entire field of grass. But then the blonde, for some reason, opened her surprised eyes even wider and objected. She said the flowers were in excellent condition. Usually the mercenaries just pluck the flowers like savages and then they lose their value. The blonde scratched his nose and said sheepishly that you might not be able to tell from him, but he was very neat. Rosa thanked the barbarian for his work and gave him his reward, 1 silver coin. It would barely be enough for the cheapest food, but it was still the first money Katal had earned through honest work. The guy smiled softly in response, thinking that he was even a little touched. Katal stood up from the table and said that he was very pleased. So, could he take the next task right away? Rosa looked at him in bewilderment, realizing that it was impossible that Katala would be satisfied with such payment. The barbarian said enthusiastically that the sun was still high. He wanted to do as much as possible. Rosa wondered why he looked so happy. The girl wanted to cry from confusion and turned to her mother, saying that this mercenary was also an oddball. The barbarian then pointed to the last task in the earlier quest, which mentioned cleaning out the warehouse. The girl sighed heavily in response, thinking that after collecting the herbs, this was already the third cleaning. Looking at the barbarian's contented face, she wondered if maybe he just liked cleaning. Rosa responded awkwardly by saying that she would like to ask Katal for help if possible. Katal, having agreed, after some time went behind a certain door, quietly opening it. The middle-aged girl turned around in bewilderment, looking at the unexpected guest. The blonde looked at her and smiled good-naturedly, saying that he had come to clean the warehouse. The woman with the red braid immediately picked up the mop and raised it in fear, swinging it. And the guy turned to her, asking if she was the owner of the warehouse. She confusedly agreed, still perplexed by the presence of the barbarian. Cleaning the warehouse was easy because it was not difficult for him to move all the things inside. The next task was cleaning the streets. Katal took a broom and swept the floor. It was difficult to control the force at first, but in the end there were no problems. All this time, an old man was watching Katal through binoculars and he muttered why a barbarian, clearly no weaker than a Superman, was doing this at all. The old man knew that Katal had enough power to change the course of the kingdom's history if he wanted to. If he showed his power, he would be accepted anywhere. But still, this barbarian, accustomed to a forceful solution, takes on such trivial matters. Taking a closer look, the old man noticed that Katal wasn't even cleaning up half-heartedly. Looking at the barbarian's inspired face, the old man noted that he was taking the cleaning very seriously. The man with gray hair lowered his binoculars for a moment, watching the madman's actions in surprise. Katal muttered how good it felt. The old man froze, completely not understanding his intentions. After some time, birds appeared before the guy's eyes, chirping loudly in the morning. The man extended his fist and stretched after a long sleep, trying to wake up. Then the ash barbarian slowly got out of bed, finally starting a new day. Getting out of bed, the surprised blonde noticed a small bag on the shelf next to him. The bag of money was quite small. It's unlikely that the mercenary's pay was large. Rosa told him it was a good job for the first day and then gave him a reward for completing all the tasks. Remembering these moments, the man opened his eyes wide and looked closely at the bag. That day, Rosa smiled awkwardly and said that there were 15 silver coins in it. Taking the award in his hands, the blonde smiled brightly and exclaimed that he would come tomorrow. Smiling good-naturedly, Katal muttered that it was time to begin the second day in civilization. The little girl was sobbing loudly and clinging to her mother, who was hugging her tenderly. The rest of the passers-by looked in bewilderment at something that was walking along the streets. Katal didn't pay attention to the sidelong glances because he was focused on exploring the city. Looking around, the barbarian suddenly stopped near some building, as if deep in thought. Then the blonde barely opened his mouth and thoughtfully muttered that it was some kind of building. Looking at the small building, he asked if it was the local library. And after just a few moments, a small bell on the door appeared before the guy's eyes. The librarian greeted the guest and turned around, wanting to look at him. The barbarian towered over her, his eyes flashing sternly and asking if he would read books if she didn't mind. At first, the girl even screamed in fear when she noticed the man's figure, but then she calmed down. And after some time, pages of books appeared before the barbarian's eyes. Katal read the books with curiosity, smiling contentedly and greedily absorbing all the information. But the librarian couldn't take her eyes off the strange barbarian, who was surprisingly calm. The old man who was watching him thought that the ignorant and wild barbarian was reading a book, and he could not see him from the observation point, but he could definitely feel his presence. The old man wondered if the barbarians of the snowy wasteland were more cultured than ordinary people. Looking at the barbarian's good-natured face, the old man wondered if he could be a unique representative. But after some time, the guy finally finished reading the history book, saying that in the end, the Empire won. An image of a girl from the snowy wasteland flashed before his eyes, saying that she was heading to a kingdom at war with the Empire to sell weapons. The barbarian thought that it seemed that the war had ended in victory for the Empire. The current country seemed incredibly powerful to him. Imagining hundreds of soldiers, the barbarian thought that the empire was so powerful that the kingdom of Barkin was now a vassal. Katal understood that the empire had swallowed up half of the human world and was continuing to advance as if it wanted to swallow up the entire world. The man then rubbed his chin and muttered thoughtfully something about world domination. His eyes sparkled as he muttered that he could put aside the affairs of men and move on to what he wanted to study. And then the Ash Barbarian took from the shelves a book about non-humans, where their types were described. Opening it, the barbarian thought that this book contained fantastic records about non-humans existing in the world. The largest cave in the world, which is full of minerals like garbage, is the cave of the gnomes, Gulmantamia. There was also a fairy village, Pisarapia, where the sun shone brightly over a fairy tale place. The aerial city of the Celestials, La Himeria with its white stone walls, was like something out of a fairy tale. There was also an unknown sacred land that no one could remember. The sacred sanctuary of all elves, Elfosagrad. Even the most powerful tried to find it by all means, but failed. The guy thought that only he was able to obtain the exclusive right to visit the elven sanctuary. But then the blonde suddenly opened his eyes wide and froze in surprise. The man began to greedily read the lines of the book, muttering, "Are there really other places that look like a wasteland? Demonic realms are places where humans are forbidden to enter, and which are full of twisted creatures and anomalies. There are quite a few demonic realms, but there are 5 that are particularly large. The first place turned out to be a terrifying forest of silence that silently colors everything around. There was also an abyss that pulled the world into the depths of evil, and was more like hell. The third demonic place turned out to be the deep sea where primates live and breathe. There was also a deep hole in which there was nothing. Only a bright rainbow colored its edges. The last place was a white, snowy wasteland. In demonic worlds live terrifying monsters called anomalies. However, demonic worlds cannot extend to the human world. Katal wondered how big this world was. The blonde recalled that the wasteland alone was enormous, and to imagine that there were several such places was simply unimaginable. The man then stood up abruptly from the table and put the books away, saying that he was finished. The man then smiled kindly and thanked the librarian, saying it had been educational. The girl almost jumped up in her chair in response, agreeing with a trembling voice. After some time, a small arch appeared before his eyes, which led to the street. Katal came to Russia and asked if there were any tasks. She awkwardly exclaimed that the master had returned. Then the blonde gave him a blank assignment sheet, and the barbarian smiled enthusiastically in response. The old man, who continued to watch them, muttered that this was a very unusual task. Wrapping the scarf tighter around his head, Swordmaster Cain said that he would have to personally meet Katal, whom he had been watching for 2 days. After some time, a bright moon finally rose over the town, barely illuminating the night streets. Katal was finally heading home after a long and hard day at the guild. Katal smiled contentedly, thinking that he had completed more than a dozen tasks throughout the day. Katal thought that even such small tasks accumulate over time, and this is quite profitable. Walking through the alleys, the barbarian thought that if he continued in the same spirit, the day when he would be recognized as a real mercenary would come sooner. But at the same time, Cain was waiting for the man, hiding around the corner of the house. When the swordmaster suddenly came out to meet the blonde, he was taken aback and froze for a moment. The old man in the green cloak cast a tense glance at the ashen barbarian he had been watching earlier. Looking at the silhouette of the old man in the distance, the blonde suddenly asked if he had been following him. The swordmaster's eyes widened in surprise, even wanting to ask him again. The blonde folded his arms across his chest in displeasure and asked what the old man wanted from him. He wondered how he could have been noticed. Cain had clearly suppressed his presence with his aura, so no matter how keen his instincts were, it was impossible to sense him. Then the blonde man suddenly grabbed his sword and frowned, asking if the old man was really a bandit. Noticing the old man's surprised look, the blonde said that judging by his reaction, he had guessed right, because even in places with good security there are bandits. Cain quickly defended himself and then wondered if Katal would believe him if he said he was a swordmaster. The barbarian asked if it had really come to the point where people had to rob in their old age. He decided that the economy was indeed in decline. Then the man thought for a moment and put his hand to his chin, looking down for a moment. Then the barbarian smiled brightly and his eyes flashed, saying that if he caught the bandit, it would be a good achievement for him. The swordmaster continued to listen to the barbarian's chatter in bewilderment, barely audibly asking him to repeat himself. Cain tried to calm down, deciding that maybe this was even a good opportunity since he had been mistaken for a bandit. The old man bared his fist and thought that perhaps the best way was to fight him directly and find out Katal's strength and identity. But the blonde didn't decide to stand still either, and so he also took a couple of steps towards the old man. The swordmaster's eyes widened in surprise, watching the barbarian's every move carefully. But the man did not raise his gaze to his opponent, slowly approaching him. But a moment later, the man suddenly disappeared, leaving Cain frozen in bewilderment. The old man's eyes widened in fear, and he wondered if the ashen barbarian had disappeared. But then the barbarian appeared behind the old man and glared angrily, causing him to turn around sharply. And then the man suddenly stretched his hand forward, and purple energies immediately began to appear around it. Cain thought that he simply couldn't remain standing like this, and a green haze appeared under his feet. Circles of green energy began to appear around the blonde as Cain realized that he would simply be grabbed by the throat. But looking at the strange greenish haze next to him, the man only grinned and turned around. And then the blonde smiled brightly and praised the swordmaster, saying that he was quite fast. The old man looked at the barbarian with bewilderment, not understanding how he could almost grab him. Cain knew that if he had reacted a split second later, he would have been caught. But even more surprisingly, he did not feel any aura from Katal. The blonde smiled good-naturedly, saying that it was interesting. Cain, however, did not understand how he could move so fast using only a human body. And then the old man smiled nervously, suddenly realizing that this was no longer just a test. The swordmaster clenched his teeth sharply and pounced on the blonde, deciding to give it his all. The blonde didn't even think of rushing at his enemy, and so he only lowered his gaze for a moment. But a moment later, the ashen barbarian disappeared again, leaving no trace of himself. And a moment later, the blonde was behind the old man and suddenly grabbed him by the hand. Cain turned around in fear, not understanding how the barbarian had managed to react if he had enhanced his perception. And just a moment later, the old man's arm was twisted behind his back, causing him to almost scream. The old man understood that it was not just a feeling of being grabbed, but that his hand was stuck in a boulder that was dragging his entire body. The old man tried to resist, but in the end he only bared his teeth again, not understanding what kind of power it was. Feeling the pain in his body again, the swordmaster realized that he couldn't even compete with the barbarian. And so Cain decided to go all out and unleash his power, pushing Katal away from him sharply. The blonde opened his eyes wide, looking at the huge haze near the old man's body. The barbarian still held the swordmaster's hand tightly, not understanding what that strange light was all around. Katal froze for a moment, staring in fascination at the green smoke rising into the sky. And just a few moments later, a very impressive explosion of green energy was heard. The swordmaster managed to dexterously break free from the barbarian's grasp, pushing off from him and assuming a fighting stance. But the blonde still couldn't stop admiring the green rays of energy that were circling in his hand. The old man cast a tense glance at Katal, frowning deeply and preparing for battle. Katal smiled awkwardly and said that bandits these days really have a lot of tricks. Cain didn't understand why he still called him a bandit. Cain thought that only those who stood at the top among the warriors were capable of materializing mana. So why should someone like that engage in robbery? The blonde continued to look at the old man in fascination, not understanding why he thought it was a bandit's trick. Then the swordmaster swallowed nervously and nodded his head slightly, continuing to watch Katal. Cain understood that materialized mana could tear apart even the most tempered steel. But the satisfied blonde didn't have a scratch on his body, so Cain wondered who Katal really was. Cain didn't understand if the barbarian could withstand materialized mana with his bare hands. Katal said that he was using an interesting technique. Then the blonde slowly approached the old man, saying that it was time for them to finish the slaughter. But the old man did not agree with this, and so in response he only grabbed the hilt of the sword. But suddenly the swordmaster was momentarily stunned, his eyes wide open in surprise. The man was already opposite him and was smiling softly, pressing his finger on the hilt of Cain's sword. The old man tried to hold the sword with trembling hands, but he could not resist the strength of the weakened barbarian. Then the old man clenched his teeth tighter in pain as if he was squeezing out the last of his strength, trying to resist. But after just a few moments, the sword almost fell out of the old man's trembling hands. And then the old man's eyes widened in surprise and fear, glancing at the ashen barbarian. When the master was left without a sword, The blonde's eyes flashed with unkind fire, and he reached out to the robber. The old man's eyes began to water from despair as he looked at Katal with resignation. Looking at the hand reaching out to him, the swordmaster suddenly realized that this was how he had met his end. After a while, the ash barbarian pressed his lips into a thin line, as if he was thinking about something. The blonde threw Cain's body over his shoulder, asking if this is what a bandit in a fantasy world really looks like. The guard looked at the barbarian and asked in a trembling voice what the hell that was. At arm's length, like a sack, the ashen barbarian held the man tightly by the cloak. The swordmaster lowered his gaze awkwardly, as if he was ashamed to look the guard in the eyes. The barbarian looked at the guard in confusion, holding Cain by the scruff of the neck. The guard wondered what had happened. The guard's first thought was that the barbarian had attacked the swordmaster, causing him to fear for Katal. But then the barbarian said that he had caught the thief. And the guard almost exclaimed, asking again. The blonde smiled brightly and asked if it would be considered mercenary work if he turned the thief over to the guards. The man opened his mouth wide as if he wanted to say something, but was too bewildered to utter a word. The guard looked at the barbarian in confusion, still not understanding what kind of scene this was. Everyone knew that Swordmaster Cain was a man who had reached the pinnacle of human strength. But such an important man was kept in such a humiliating position by the barbarian. The guard awkwardly replied in a trembling voice that this old man was not a thief at all. The blonde frowned and replied that since the guard knew him, the old man could be the criminal's accomplice. But the guard decided to ignore the blonde's words and therefore only took a step forward. The man bowed and greeted the only swordmaster in the entire kingdom, Cain. Then the ashen barbarian cast a puzzled glance at the old man he was holding in his arms. But the old man could not take his eyes off the floor, covered in sweat from terrible shame. The barbarian lowered Cain, wondering why a swordmaster whose title sounded so majestic was a thief. The blonde frowned and said that it was impossible since Cain had attacked him because of his silver coins. The guard replied that it was a swordmaster since he could not mistake the face. Katal said that it was possible that it was a magician who had changed his appearance. The guard said that if he was a mage of such a high level, then he would already be respected as a swordmaster. Katal continued to insist, asking if swordmaster was a nickname that thieves used. The guard froze for a moment and fell silent, and then asked what the barbarian was talking about. After a few seconds of silence, Katal asked if this was really the swordmaster. Receiving an affirmative answer, he fell silent again. The blonde looked at the guard in bewilderment, who said that he first needed to report this to the Lord. Luke was clearly not happy with this news, loudly slamming his hand on the table in anger. The Lord exclaimed and asked the guard if Lord Cain had really been defeated. At this time, Katal bowed his head and apologized, saying that he should have listened to the whole story. Cain bowed his head in response and replied that it was his fault because he didn't say anything. The men sitting at the table fell into a heavy silence for a few moments. The Lord looked at them in surprise, not understanding what kind of situation this was. He expected Cain to challenge the barbarian to a duel. Lord knew that Cain's loss was unexpected. He didn't know the details, but it was obvious. The barbarian closed his eyes guiltily, and the Lord thought that he was stronger than even the swordmaster. Of course, even among superhumans, there are different levels. Lord Cain only recently became a swordmaster, so his level must be the lowest among superhumans. But he still holds a great title. The thought of a completely uncontrollable creature defeating a swordmaster clearly frightened the Lord. The Lord's head ached as he said that from what he had heard, there had been a misunderstanding, so he was deviating. The brunette added after them that the two of them clearly needed to talk in private first, and then the man finally turned around and headed towards the exit of the room. A tense silence fell between the two men at the table again. After a few moments, the blonde looked up at the swordmaster with an attentive gaze, and he felt awkward. The old man trembled, thinking that this was extremely humiliating. He could not even justify himself because it was a complete defeat. Cain's pride wasn't just hurt, it was torn to shreds. But then he put his mug down and turned to Katal. The old man pressed his hand to his chest and introduced himself, looking at the blonde man tensely. Katal asked if his last name was Swordmaster. He replied that when you reach that level, your last name loses all meaning. Katal turned to him and asked if the attack he had shown earlier was a Swordmaster technique. Then the man froze for a moment and sighed heavily, his eyes wide open. The old man extended his hand and materialized mana, causing a green haze to appear around him. The blonde opened his mouth wide and was very surprised, thinking that he had not attached any importance to this, deciding that these were just thief's techniques. But now that he knew it was a swordmaster skill, the blonde was truly impressed. The old man pressed his hand to his heart and said that this was a manifestation of mysticism, but it is also called aura. Remembering the Swordmaster's attack, the blonde man blushed slightly and asked curiously if it was an aura. The blonde then stood up abruptly and excitedly asked how he could learn to use it. The old man sighed and said that, in essence, it was necessary to control mysticism and manifest it. The blonde's eyes widened, watching the master in fascination and asking if mysticism was similar to mana. Cain replied that mysticism means mystical energy itself, and when it is used as an aura, it becomes the domain of swordsmen. The swordmaster said that if you use mysticism as mana, then it belongs to the magicians. The blonde smiled brightly in response and concluded that both mages and swordsmen could use mysticism. Katal asked to be taught this technique because, unfortunately, he had not yet expanded his knowledge sufficiently. The barbarian came closer and smiled brightly, asking again to teach him. The old man recoiled in fear but then agreed. Cain asked, confused, if there was a reason why Katal was asking him for advice since he was stronger than him. Katal replied that he knew nothing about mysticism and fencing, so he was just swinging a sword without any knowledge. At first, Cain asked awkwardly and then thought that he had been defeated without even drawing his sword. Cain decided to teach the barbarian the way of the sword and show him the greatness of fencing, as well as restore his trampled reputation. After a few seconds of silence, the man finally agreed thoughtfully. Cain smiled sadly and said that he was a master of the sword, but without a weapon, he was no more than half a man. The blonde frowned and said that he thought so. It was no wonder that Cain would appear weak if he didn't use a sword. The old man immediately opened his eyes wide and began to confusedly agree with the barbarian. The barbarian closed his eyes and said that he found it strange, since Cain was called a sword master with that level of power. The barbarian said that if Cain had used the sword, he might have won. He wondered if that was true. The blonde man smiled brightly and said enthusiastically that he would look forward to it. Cain wondered if he could restore his self-respect. Before the regression, Katal had studied fencing itself, but now it was a real fantasy activity. But the swordplay in their world had a strange form that used the mysterious power of aura. Cain said that the most distinctive feature of his style is the materialization of illusions. He asked what Katal saw when he fought his student. The blonde replied thoughtfully that the sword strike was divided into 3 parts, and all of them were real strikes. Then the blonde turned around abruptly and said that he understood what the old man was talking about when he kept talking about materialization. Katal said that style is closer to skill than strength. Cain was silent at first, and then agreed. The master said that fencing is the art of merging the sword and aura to control the mystical power. The one who reaches the end of the path becomes a master of the sword. The old man then suddenly drew his sword, pointing it towards Katal and using mana materialization. The blonde's eyes sparkled brightly as he joyfully exclaimed that he finally understood the meaning of the aura. Closing his eyes, the old man still could not believe what was happening, and therefore froze for a couple of seconds. Clutching his sword, the old man said that the materialization of illusion may seem difficult to understand. The old man couldn't believe that he was actually teaching the barbarian fencing, but he still said that he would show the materialization. The man first swung his flaming sword, then looked tensely at the barbarian. The old man swung his arm sharply and hit the floor, immediately breaking it into 2 pieces. Then 4 beams of green energy emerged from his sword, which broke the earth into equal parts. Katal watched the blow in amazement, his eyes wide in astonishment. And then the swordmaster's strike was divided into 5 parts, making it even more powerful. A few moments later, a fairly large ledge appeared in the wall and smoke was flying around it. Cain put down his sword and said that there were many techniques that created illusions using aura. The old man said that only his style allows energy to take physical form. The blonde turned to him and asked about the technique. The old man proudly said, beaming with happiness, that it really was a mystical technique. But the blonde suddenly interrupted him and said that most likely he could do it too. The old man, whose self-esteem had just improved, asked in bewilderment what kind of nonsense this was. Cain has dedicated his entire life to the sword. Through natural talent and grueling training, he has achieved this level with great difficulty. It is impossible to copy it just by seeing it once. But Katal pulled the old man out of his thoughts by taking the axe and saying that it would be faster if he showed it. The blonde smiled good-naturedly, looking forward, and the swordmaster did not understand why he needed an axe. And then the blonde suddenly bent down and assumed a fighting pose, swinging the weapon. The blonde continued to smile with satisfaction, fully believing in his own strength. And then the blonde swung the axe several times, cutting the air into several pieces. The swordmaster watched him in surprise, his eyes wide open and wondering what was going on. But looking at him, Cain understood that the barbarian was simply moving quickly, relying on his strength. and just a few moments later, the barbarian sharply cut the earth into 5 parts, pushing off. And then there was a destructive explosion of flame, which destroyed everything in its wake. The Swordmaster almost screamed as he looked at the terrifying power of the Ashen Barbarian. Then the Ash Barbarian finally lowered his axe, which began to smoke heavily. The man smiled brightly and asked what the Swordmaster thought about his blow. Kaig thought that it really did look like his blow, but it only seemed that way because of the monstrous strength and speed. Cain said that Katal simply waved his hand without using any technique or aura. The barbarian replied that the result was similar and that fencing was made for real combat. The blonde's eyes widened and he asked curiously if it mattered if it made almost no difference. And at that very moment, the old man immediately hesitated, trying to justify himself with a trembling voice. The Swordmaster thought that Katal was right, of course, but it still hurt his pride. But then the Swordmaster suddenly grabbed the hilt of his sword, asking how about this? And just a moment later, copies of the old man appeared in the air, shrouded in green mysticism. The blonde watched what was happening in surprise, realizing that the master's body had split. Afterwards, the green energy seemed to gather into one huge ball, which blazed brightly. And just a moment later, there was a powerful explosion, which was even more powerful than the barbarians. Katal and the Swordmaster stood on the scorched earth, looking at each other in bewilderment. Cain said it was a division of the body achieved by absolute control over the aura. Then the old man finally turned around and addressed the blonde man, asking if he could repeat it. But the man decided to ignore the old man in response, and so he just turned around and walked away. The old man looked at the barbarian with bewilderment, as he walked away without even thinking about turning around. Then the blonde man tensed even more as he turned back to the old man and swung the axe sharply. Within a moment, sparkling rays of purple energy began to appear in the air, hovering around the barbarian. The old man opened his eyes wide, looking at his student's skills in bewilderment. A funnel of his energy seemed to be gathering around the Ash Barbarian, and it was quickly swirling. And after just a couple of seconds, the purple energy took the form of a tornado and headed high into the sky. The merch circled around the blonde's body, destroying absolutely everything in its path and razing it to the ground. Then the blonde smiled contentedly and lowered the axe, asking the Swordmaster's opinion on the matter. But turning around, the blonde noticed only an old man who was shaking violently and fell to his knees. The old man looked at the bewildered barbarian, not understanding how he could be defeated in the fencing that he had honed his entire life. The Swordmaster lost control of himself as he suddenly leaned over and said that this was simply unbelievable. The only thing Cain wanted was to just burst into tears and not see the barbarian. The blonde exhaled tiredly and muttered thoughtfully that the master's strength of spirit was weaker than he expected. But despite such rude words, the blonde still took a few steps towards him. A tear flowed from the old man's eye when the blonde said that his fencing was simply amazing. The old man looked at Katal in confusion, who insisted that he had simply swung an axe and that this was not real fencing. Katal insisted that the style Cain showed was not a sham. It was real, and he would never be able to achieve such mastery. Then the old man clenched his teeth, having previously been looking in fascination at the ashen barbarian above him. Cain was glad that his swordsmanship was still valued, since mana materialization was a technique that only he could use. Then the man clenched his fist tightly and decided that it was not a matter of weakness in his style. The Swordmaster decided that this barbarian was simply crazy, because only a madman could move so quickly. The old man suddenly stood up from the ground and threatened the barbarian with his fist, deciding that a person could not create such a thing without an aura. It was beyond his capabilities. But when the blonde asked if Cain would teach him real fencing techniques, he froze for a moment. The old man apologized and said that he was momentarily overcome with emotion. Katal replied that he understood, and then the Swordmaster thoughtfully rubbed his mustache and coughed, as if drawing attention to himself. Cain said that first Katal must learn to control the aura, but to do this, he must awaken the mysticism. Cain said that no mage, swordsman, or witch can reach a high level without awakening mysticism. Only those who believe in the gods can achieve this. Katal opened his eyes in surprise and asked if divine power was something else. Cain replied that miracles fight gods directly, and they do not depend much on personal abilities. In response, the man thoughtfully rubbed his chin and looked at the old man with curiosity. Cain said that mysticism is a mysterious power hidden within everyone, and how a barbarian controls it determines everything. Katal realized that the first step to gaining aura, mana, or commanding spirits was to awaken the mystic. There were 5 stages of mysticism. The first was feeling mysticism. This is a state of awareness, awakening and feeling mysticism. Katal asked if not everyone could sense it. Cain replied that without talent, it was impossible to even sense it. The Swordmaster insisted that those who are able to sense it are given third rank. Cain said that depending on the ability to control mysticism, one of 5 ranks is assigned. The third rank is the initial one. The barbarian remembered the words of the blue-haired girl who spoke about 5 ranks and 5 categories. Looking away, the Ash Barbarian wondered what that thing back then had been. Cain said that overall it's just a convenient classification system, and there's a huge difference between rank and they're not always clearly separated. The master insisted that it was enough to simply understand the general idea and then suggested that we begin. Looking sternly at the barbarian, he repeated that the first stage was to feel the mysticism. The swordmaster told Katal to feel everything around him. He had to expand his senses as much as he could. Katal was instructed to feel the movement of the passing wind. The master told him to perceive everything and feel a separate presence within it. Katal sat in the cave and meditated following all the prompts from the swordmaster. He would start to lose concentration, but then he would gather himself again and concentrate again. The barbarian said that he still didn't feel anything, and the master was perplexed by this outcome. He couldn't believe that someone as strong as this barbarian couldn't sense his surroundings. It wasn't a strict law, but those who were strong even without mana usually had a higher chance of feeling mysticism. But apparently this barbarian was an exception. The old man suggested that perhaps this was a characteristic of people born in the snowy wasteland. Katal said that no one around him had ever felt what is called mystical. The master said that at first it is not easy to feel mysticism. Then this time he will transfer his energy to Katal. The man was glad that the master was offering him to share his energy and smiled. The master didn't look so happy, but it was worth a try. Katal was ready to start as soon as possible as he was really interested in trying it. The master rose from the floor and came closer to Katal. He asked him to relax his whole body and focus his feelings on the physical body. The old man placed his hand on Katal's back and told him to feel the mana being transmitted to him. The master was stunned as soon as he touched Katal's back. He stood there for a while, not believing that this was really a human body. In the humble opinion of the swordmaster, Katal's body was as hard as a rock. Noticing that Cain had frozen in place, Katal turned around and called out to him. The old man waved his hands and asked for forgiveness, saying that he had been lost in thought for a moment. Then he began to transfer his aura to Katal, extending his hand forward again. He believed that he would soon find the way and thought that the main thing was to awaken the mystical power dormant inside the body. But after some time, nothing happened, and Cain began to look surprised. His expression indicated that the man could not figure out what was happening. He could not find a way to the mystical power inside Katal's body. More precisely, the master could not reach this very power. At this time, Katal sat with a blissful expression on his face, expecting that a miracle would certainly happen now. No matter how far Cain extended his aura, he couldn't reach or see anything. He compared it to the feeling of falling into a deep sea of the abyss. After trying again, the old man finally came to the conclusion that his methods were not working. He removed his hand from Katal's back and cleared his throat, attracting the attention of the bewildered barbarian. Katal asked what he meant by it won't work and also couldn't believe that he had no talent. But that wasn't the case. So the old man said that transferring the aura into his body wasn't enough. Katal had to find the way within himself and awaken the dormant power. The barbarian turned and said that he knew it, and then the old man began to speak again. Cain said that no mystical power could be found in Katal's body. The man became upset and asked if this meant that he could not feel the mystical at all. But the master replied that this was also not true because he could not even check it. The master continued to talk about how Katal's body was special. To enter the mystical path, the aura must penetrate deep into the body, but Katal's body was dense and heavy. This was also a first for the old man. Who would have thought that pure physical strength could block an aura? The barbarian closed his eyes and was extremely annoyed that even the master swordsman could not help him. When Katal asked about the possibility of him receiving magical power, Cain answered ambiguously. He said that he could not even understand whether there was a path to the mystical or not. The swordmaster also advised Katal to turn to other masters who were good at using aura. He apologized for not being of any use, and Katal assured the master that everything was fine. The barbarian still had a chance, and that was enough for now. Having emerged from his thoughts, the barbarian rose to his feet and began to speak again. He smiled and said that he had learned a lot from Cain. The old man could not find the words to react to such a statement. The barbarians he had met before were all bloodthirsty beasts. They lived to commit crimes, and so they were outcasts for all nations. But this barbarian seemed different to him. So he asked Katal if he wanted to stay in this kingdom. The man asked what he meant, and the old man explained that he was offering Katal an oath of allegiance and a title. With his strength, he could get a high position, and Cain said he could be his patron. But despite the fact that it all sounded interesting, Katal hastened to refuse, saying that he had no desire to obey anyone. Cain thought that if he could subjugate this barbarian to the suzerain, then much would change. For example, they could free themselves from the empire's rule in these lands. So Cain began to insist, saying that Katal could receive a title of nobility. The man thought again, but he already knew the answer to the swordmaster's words. Katal said he wants to enjoy life the way he likes. The swordmaster was shocked by what he heard, because in his memory no one had ever refused the title. So all he could do was keep his questions to himself and accept this answer. Katal thanked the old man and extended his hand to him, saying that he would never forget this service. Cain looked down, still unable to find any words to answer. After the meeting ended, the swordmaster walked down the long corridor back to the palace building. For some reason, he reproached himself and thought about how ridiculous the thoughts that flashed through his head were. For a moment, it seemed to him that he could take control of this barbarian, but Katal was too willful. He could be part of the group, but nothing more. The old man could not understand him at all, so in some sense, he could even be more dangerous than the other barbarians. He was still a being from the demonic world, a barbarian from the snowy wasteland. Having finished his internal monologue, the old man exhaled and stopped. He looked out the huge window, one of many that lined this corridor. The swordmaster thought that he had no idea what His Majesty was thinking about when he sent an expedition to the demonic world. After some time, the old man told the Lord about the expedition. He said that many lives would be lost in vain under the pretext of reconnaissance. Perhaps the current emperor slept and saw himself becoming the second coming of the ancient emperor. The most absurd thing was that the empire had not yet even conquered all the kingdoms of the human race. The Lord became nervous when he realized that the time would come anyway. These lands also belonged to the empire, so it was better to know about everything in advance. Cain said that the world was strange enough as it was, and now even the emperor seemed half mad to him. Hearing this from his friend, the Lord jerked as if he understood something. He looked at his interlocutor from under his brows and asked if these really weren't just rumors. The old man did say that the demon's movements were starting to become noticeable, so no, these weren't rumors. As soon as the statement was uttered, the Lord's face became completely gloomy and frightened. The swordmaster continued to analyze the situation, saying that the frequency of dungeons appearing was also unusual. There were rumors that the distortion of the demonic world was breaking through into their world. Something was happening, and it was clearly not for the benefit of humanity. Having finished building up the atmosphere, the old man opened his eyes again and sat up straight in his chair. He asked the Lord if he found it strange that it was already here. Cain was interested to hear his comrade's opinion of what was happening. But the Lord only bowed his head and replied that he did not know. After some time, he replied that at least it did not show hostility towards them. But he wasn't sure about the rest. And for some reason, the image of Katal popped into his head. A new day was descending upon the kingdom, illuminating all the houses with sunlight. Katal walked happily through the streets, clearly in high spirits. He turned around for a moment because he heard strange sounds behind him. Behind him, he saw a woman calming her child. Katal noticed that some townsman was also afraid of him and was hiding behind the wall. At that moment, he seriously thought about what he was doing wrong. The thought occurred to Varvara that people were afraid of him and panicking because of his clothes. He started looking down at his clothes, thinking that they probably thought he was crazy and wanted to stay away. And then the barbarian suddenly opened his eyes, deciding to change something right now. Katal was inspired to buy new clothes to look more like the locals. After some time, he came to the studio where different fabrics lay on the counters. The door opened, and the bell on it signaled the arrival of a new customer. The tailor, who was trying on a jacket on a mannequin, turned around and looked in the direction of the person who entered. The words of greeting stuck in his throat because a barbarian was now standing in front of him. A real barbarian with a menacing face announced to the tailor that he would like to buy clothes. The tailor apologized and said that he did not have clothes of the right size. Katal asked what could be done with it, and the worker replied that if he gave them time, they could make something to order. The barbarian was clearly delighted at the prospect of getting normal clothes, so he asked to have something custom made for him. The tailor said he would contact Katal when everything was ready. He was already seeing images in his head of an enraged barbarian complaining about his poor clothes. The man was ready to start throwing a tantrum right there on the spot, but he couldn't show that he was scared. Coming out of the studio, Katal noticed something under his feet. There, on the cobblestone ground, lay a glowing blue sphere. He reached out to the strange object and lifted it from the ground to examine it more closely. It seemed to Katal like some kind of precious stone, but at the same time, there was something strange about it. It was as if some kind of power was sealed inside the stone, shining and shimmering with all shades of blue. The barbarian continued to look at his find for some time and then, realizing that he would not see anything, he took it with him. Putting the shear in his pocket, Katal decided that he would simply ask about it at the guild. Today, Secretary Rosa was on duty at the guild, and she had to answer the barbarian's questions. He handed the ball to the girl and asked her if she knew what it was, explaining that he had found the thing on the way here. According to him, it didn't look like an ordinary ball, and it seemed that the girl thought so too. She said it didn't look like a jewel either, but judging by the smooth surface, it was probably the work of a craftsman. Rosa continued to look at the thing in her hands, and the sight of this stone was truly mesmerizing. Her eyes gradually became completely dark, as if they were covered with a veil. The girl said that this ball looks quite valuable, at least at first glance. Suddenly, she was pulled out of her thoughts by a sharp sound, as if someone had snapped their fingers. Rosa immediately came to her senses and her eyes regained their usual appearance. She sat with the stone in her hand, bewildered and not remembering what had happened at all. Katal, who was opposite, asked her if she was okay. The girl asked what he meant, and the barbarian replied that it seemed to him that this stone attracted her consciousness. The guild secretary continued to not understand what was happening, and the barbarian gave up trying to explain. According to Rosa, this ball was difficult to identify, but there was some strange energy on it. The girl asked if this ball needed to be assessed, and Katal replied that he would figure it out himself because there was also an interest in this. Then he finally got to the point, asking what assignments there were for today. A few minutes later, Rosa returned from behind the reception desk with a form and handed it to Katal. He read the entire list of tasks with joy and enthusiasm. The barbarian spent the whole day at work, carrying out more and more assignments. So he returned home when it was already dark outside, and the moon was shining brightly in the night sky. He lay down on the bed, putting his hands under his head, and thought that night was coming again. Before going to bed, the man took out the gem again and examined it. He remembered how Rosa looked when she took the stone in her hands, as if this thing hypnotized her. As soon as he asked if this object had any function, something changed. Katal heard a voice from the sphere telling him to go somewhere. This voice told Katal to go to some storage, but such tricks did not work on the barbarian, so he was not hypnotized, but listened to it as noise. Someone even kindly transmitted instructions directly to his head. Most likely it was some kind of subordination magic. The sphere still did not fall silent, and the instructions continued to be transmitted into Katal's head. For a few moments he thought about something and became quiet. The man looked out the window at the shining moon and wondered whether he should go. But the voice was so insistent that Katal quickly got ready and set out on his way. He continued walking, mentally cursing at the voice in his head because it was tired of repeating the same thing. After some time, the barbarian arrived at his destination and stared ahead. He stood at the entrance to some cave, wondering if this was it. Katal smiled in anticipation of new adventures and was ready for any turn. Somewhere inside the cave, there was someone who had been guiding that voice all this time. Katal said that he came and asked where the one who called him was, starting to look around. And the thought flashed through the stranger's head that another victim had come to him. He was surprised that it was a dumb barbarian this time. But judging by his size, he should have been a good victim. The owner of that voice was a skeleton with glowing eyes, and now he was thinking that the time had come to go. He sat in the middle of a pentagram drawn on the floor and thought that the resurrection would soon take place. The past. A time of chaos when many kingdoms were destroyed by a sorcerer who manipulated emotions. He subjugated the minds of kings, unleashed wars, but his extreme evil was eventually revealed, and he was hunted. However, just before his defeat, he had already transferred his soul into the vessel of life, allowing him to become a lich. And since resurrection required a significant amount of life force, he settled near a remote estate and scattered enchanted spheres, collecting victims one after another. The spheres, which were shiny stones, served as mana cores needed for resurrection. And with his great power, he planned to conquer the world again. And this goal was steadily approaching success. The Lich wondered why the barbarian had come to him. It was a rather remote area, so the Lich had chosen this place precisely because of the absence of extra eyes. The Lich wondered why the barbarian's presence in his lair seemed so unnatural. The Lich glanced at the barbarian's miniature, thinking that these creatures from the north had gone too far, but Katal would make a good prey. The Lich had previously placed a special effect on the sphere. It hypnotizes only those who have not mastered mysticism. Therefore, anyone who ended up in his lair because of the sphere does not know about mysticism. Therefore, Katal is an ordinary person, unaware of mysticism. The Lich was uneasy that the barbarian did not look hypnotized, but he decided that it was because of an illusion. The Lich smiled wickedly and looked at the fire in his hand, in which the silhouette of the barbarian was visible. He ordered Katal to come to him. The Lich ordered him to become the cornerstone for his resurrection. After some time, Katal found the door that led to that very place. Then the man finally opened the huge wooden door, stepping forward. But as soon as Katal entered the room, he immediately opened his eyes wide and looked down. And the skeleton smiled nastily, and bright blue lights immediately sparkled in his eyes. Then the great sorcerer gripped his staff more tightly, already preparing to attack. In front of Katal's face was a huge silhouette of a skeleton, dressed in a long black robe. The blonde looked at the Lich with admiration, thinking that this was indeed a real creature. Katal understood that this was the highest form a twisted sorcerer could attain. A creature that always appeared in fantasy as a villain. Katal thought that he had never expected to see a real Lich. The same one asked in bewilderment who the barbarian was. The Lich thoughtfully asked if he had not been hypnotized by the sphere. Katal agreed and said that he understood how the Lich lured people to him. The skeleton looked at Katal with bewilderment, thinking that he didn't sense a drop of mysticism from him, and therefore he really was just a barbarian. The Lich said that Katal most likely had a mind protection artifact. He thought that he did not understand how a barbarian could obtain an artifact of such a level. The skeleton smiled and said that it seemed like Katal was just lucky to find it somewhere. He replied that he had nothing like that. The Lich asked if Katal thought he could trick him, and then used his staff. The Lich said that if Katal had obediently fallen under his spell, he could have died without pain, but now he would have to be crushed by force. And then several skeletons, whose bones had previously been scattered across the floor, slowly began to rise from the floor. The skeletons grinned madly at Katal as the Lich ordered them to move forward. And then his servants immediately rushed forward with all their might, swinging their swords to attack. The blonde thought that this was a dungeon where an evil Lich was hiding. Smiling, he said that he understood what was happening. And then one of the skeletons managed to run up to him and almost cut off his head with a blade. But the man, with just one blow, abruptly cut off the skeleton's head, causing it to fall apart. The Lich looked at the barbarian in bewilderment, even opening his eyes wide in surprise for a moment. The sorcerer then turned his gaze to the corpse of his henchman, who was defeated in a couple of moments. The blonde looked at the skeleton with indifference, saying that the Lich was much more superficial than he thought. The skeleton slowly gritted his teeth in anger, as if trying to hide his irritation. The Lich said he would see if Katal could speak after he cut off his limbs, because as long as he was alive, that was all that mattered. But then several more silhouettes of skeletons began to rise from the floor, and he gave them the order to kill the barbarian. But the Ash Barbarian wasn't too scared even then. He just clenched his fists tighter, preparing to attack. And just a moment later, the barbarian sharply pushed the first skeleton away from himself and beheaded it. A few moments later, the same fate befell the next skeleton, who didn't even have time to get close to him. The Ash Barbarian then launched another attack at the skeleton, slamming it into the wall and nearly crushing it. And just moments later, the barbarian slammed the skeleton's body into the ground, shattering it into pieces. Even the Lich's mouth dropped open in surprise for a moment, watching the barbarian's actions with bewilderment. Looking at the headless corpse, Katal muttered that just like Hassan said, they die after they lose their heads. The barbarian said that since the sorcerer was a Lich, he thought that he would at least command the Death Knights or someone stronger. The barbarian asked if the great sorcerer had only ordinary skeletons in his lair. These words wounded the Lich, hitting him in the heart. Even more angry, the sorcerer held out his staff and said that he had entertained this bastard for too long. The staff, the end of which resembled a crescent moon in shape, suddenly began to glow with a blue light. He then ordered the skeleton to rise up, and immediately a strong armor with horns appeared around it. And then the blonde opened his eyes wide, looking at his opponent and realizing who was in front of him. Looking at the enemy, Katal thought that he did not expect to surprise the skeleton knight there again. Katal thought that since the knight was created by the Lich, perhaps his powers were a little different, which made it more interesting. And then the great sorcerer extended his hand forward, from which materialized mana immediately appeared. The Lich ordered the skeleton to kill Katal, who immediately smiled nastily and rushed at his enemy. Katal smiled brightly and clenched his fist, saying contentedly that this was a skeleton knight created by the Lich. And then the skeleton ran up to the barbarian's face and swung with all his might to strike him. Katal pulled the skeleton towards himself and ran, carrying it with him and asking how strong it was. A few moments later, Katal threw the knight to the floor with all his might, breaking him into pieces again. But Katal wasn't going to stop there, and so after a couple of seconds, he threw it back on the floor. Then before the barbarian's eyes appeared only heavy clouds of smoke, which obscured his entire vision. But the smoke began to slowly dissipate, and a strange dark silhouette appeared from behind the clouds. It was a skeleton that was ready for a new attack and rushed at the barbarian, smiling madly. Katal looked at the skeleton with curiosity, saying that he recognized the strength and toughness of this creature. Hearing these cherished words, the Lich smiled and flashed his eyes, ordering the skeleton to release the mana to the fullest. And then circles of blue energy began to appear near the skeleton, rushing forward from his body. The Ash Barbarian watched the monster's attacks with delight, holding his breath for a moment. The skeleton almost caught up with the barbarian a few moments later, opening its mouth wide and jumping into the air. The skeleton pounced on the blonde, who continued to watch him indifferently. Then the man suddenly clenched his fists and thought that a skeleton knight could not do such a thing. The barbarian cut off the skeleton's head with one blow, thinking that this was still unusual. Then the skeleton's body fell to the ground and Katal quickly stepped back from it a few meters. But after a few moments, the barbarian rushed towards the skeleton again and hit him, trampling the enemy's body into the ground. In a couple of seconds, the barbarian dealt with the monster and then cast an indifferent glance at the Lich. The sorcerer still couldn't close his wide-open mouth because he was too surprised. Then the clouds of smoke again filled the entire space inside the sorcerer's lair. But it seemed as if Katal didn't pay attention to this, because he took a couple of steps forward and stepped on the bones of the skeleton. The barbarian said it was unusual, but not like something completely different. He asked if that was all. The skeleton was silent for a moment, and then asked who the barbarian really was. The Lich wondered that he felt no mysticism, no magic, no mana from the barbarian's artifact. So could it really be his own power? The Lich looked at the barbarian with curiosity, wondering if he had really defeated the skeleton knight with pure physical strength. Lich wondered if that was even possible. Then he said thoughtfully that Katal was special. The Ash Barbarian didn't expect a compliment from the Lich at all, and so he opened his eyes in bewilderment in response. Then the sorcerer grabbed his staff and said that in that case he would deal with Katal himself. Black plumes of smoke were directed at the barbarian as the Lich said that he should consider it an honor. When the black smoke screen almost covered him completely, Katal turned around in surprise and exclaimed, and a few moments later, the barbarian found himself in complete darkness, not understanding what was happening. Suddenly, sparkling blue eyes appeared in the darkness, and the Lich asked if the barbarian was afraid of him. A sorcerer appeared before Katal and said that it was right to fear him, because he would pay for invading the Lich's sanctuary. But the blonde rubbed the back of his head in bewilderment and said that he came only because the sphere called him. Katal asked in bewilderment if it was really the Lich who had thrown these spheres. And the Lich froze for a moment, feeling awkward. The Lich thought that in fact everyone who came to him was attracted by the spheres he scattered. And it was the same with the barbarian. The sorcerer raised his staff and commanded the barbarian to be silent, for he was Karos Bragulus Kessis, a great and powerful magician, the one who destroyed 5 kingdoms and fought with heroes. Katal remembered Marseille's long name and wondered what kind of fashion they had for names longer than 2 lines. Thousands of different flowers appeared around the sorcerer's staff and swirled around him. He exclaimed that the pathetic barbarian would be the basis of his resurrection, and then a colored wave of the sorcerer's mana headed towards the surprised barbarian. Gradually, the mana formed a strange funnel which acquired muddy colors, and the ashen barbarian could not tear his eyes away from the sorcerer's miracles, looking at him in fascination. And then the process of hypnosis began. It was magic, controlling human emotions. It causes negativity, trapping the victim in it until the mind is completely broken. This is a unique magic created by Karos. It is incredibly powerful with minimal mana costs. The Lich understood that this was a simple barbarian who did not possess any secret power and was powerless against real magic. The Lich thought that there was something special about this barbarian, and besides, he didn't have any special artifact on him either. Then the sorcerer snapped his fingers and said that he would take the barbarian with him and study him, and then ordered him to be dragged away. At the same time, smiling skeletons began to slowly rise from the ground, floating in blue mana. The skeleton clutched his sword tightly and looked at the floor as he slowly approached the ashen barbarian. But then Katal took a few steps forward that were definitely weightless. When the barbarian opened his eyes, he saw a nastily smiling skeleton approaching him. The barbarian's eyes flashed a bright purple fire as he cast an angry look at the skeleton. And when the skeleton almost reached him, the barbarian managed to easily step back and swing for a blow. And just a moment later, the skeleton's head was lying on the ground, separate from the rest of the body. Having finished with the first enemy, the blonde pursed his lips in irritation and turned sharply, looking around. The Lich, however, pressed his hands to his head in fear and opened his mouth wide, not understanding what was happening at all. And just a few moments later, there was a loud explosion, which shattered the floor of the shelter into pieces. The Lich gripped his staff tighter and thought with fear that this too had not worked in the battle with the barbarian. Katal asked why the Lich was just standing there and watching, and why they were trying to catch him, with the skeletons he was cracking like sunflower seeds. Then the guy sighed in disappointment and looked tiredly at the Lich, saying that this was complete boredom. And these words again hurt the sorcerer, who was too worried about his pride. Humans are creatures driven by their emotions. Even if they are incredibly strong, there will always be negativity deep down inside. Therefore, it is impossible to escape the magic that controls emotions. Katal asked if he could use magic like fireball or magic arrow. The Lich replied that he didn't know how the barbarian was still standing, but how dare he compare his magic to such low-level spells. Then the skeleton frowned more deeply and flashed its eyes, exclaiming loudly and ordering the mana to gather into a muddy stream. Around appeared exactly black drops that spread around. Lich said that a wave is needed. A huge blue circle appeared above his head, followed by black splashes of water and a huge ball. The Lich commanded to devour the world and sow confusion among the unworthy. And Katal's eyes finally sparkled with joy. Black threads with blue inclusions began to burst out of the light ball and rush towards Katal. The Lich then reached out to the barbarian through the waves and said that he would be consumed. But Katal just continued to watch what was happening in bewilderment, his eyes wide open. The aura, like sound waves, approached Katal with tremendous speed. Looking at Katal's in action, Lich smiled proudly and then laughed loudly. The Lich laughed like a madman and then exclaimed that victory would be his. But he was interrupted by his own coughing up black blood. As if unable to bear the horrific pain, the sorcerer suddenly fell to his knees and fell silent. The Lich thought that he had gone too far and used up everything except the mana needed to stay on his feet. The Lich thought that this guy shouldn't win anymore. But the barbarian interrupted his thoughts, saying that it was impressive. Then the barbarian approached the sorcerer, who grabbed the floor tightly and opened his eyes wide in fear. As Katal came closer, he asked Lich in bewilderment if that was really all. The sorcerer looked at the barbarian with a puzzled look and wondered if even that hadn't worked. He had used the most powerful dark magic of all the mind control spells. The Lich understood that even if a great hero came, a direct hit would completely destroy his mind. The Lich didn't understand who the barbarian was. The barbarian looked at his hand in bewilderment and said that it was impressive, but he didn't feel anything. And then Lich lowered his frightened gaze to the floor as if wondering what would happen next. Then the barbarian suddenly grabbed his axe and lifted it from the ground, already preparing to strike. The boy's eyes flashed unkindly as he said that if that was the Lich's best strike, then it was his turn now. The skeleton grinned evilly, indicating that he had realized something. Katal, holding his axe at the ready, looked at his opponent and asked himself a silent question. The skeleton continued to say that he knew that the barbarian had come here because he knew who he was. But the barbarian did not understand what his opponent was saying or what was going on. His interlocutor did not shut up, bursting into mad laughter, repeating over and over again that Katal was afraid of him. He said that he would still rise up and destroy this world. He had once heard that the Empire had something called a human production group. It was a place where talented individuals were raised, and this barbarian must have belonged to that group. The mad skeleton thought that Katal was an assassin sent by the Empire, but continued to laugh. He, Karos Branulus Kessis, was ready to kill Katal here and now and still destroy the Empire. By this time, Katal had already realized that the skeleton was truly crazy. Suddenly, an ancient vase appeared from somewhere, wrapped in chains and glowing. The object landed right in front of Katal, leaving him dumbfounded. Then a strange stream of energy crashed into the barbarian's chest, and the skeleton demanded that he give him the vessel. At this moment, Katal became even more perplexed and began to regret that he had come here at all. The skeleton thought that he had entered the barbarian's body and could now take over his mind. Once this happens, if he cannot be reborn as a Lich, he will live forever in the body of a barbarian. The skeleton saw no other choice, and Katal saw no changes in himself despite the enemy's pompous speeches. The skeleton said that this body now belonged to him. The next moment he found himself inside Katal's mind, but for some reason he was surprised. There was something strange about the place where he found himself, something that frightened even such a villain. It was the first time he had seen anything like this, and he realized that just looking at this place was already driving him crazy. At this point, the skeleton again chose to blame the Empire for everything that was happening. He fell to his knees and began to rage again, clutching his head. But then, as if coming to his senses, he realized that even an empire could not have created something like this. The skeleton began to crack and disintegrate, realizing that his mind was breaking down as well. Lich was shocked and made a questioning sound, which became his last words. Katal didn't understand anything and didn't feel anything, so for him, everything happened in the blink of an eye. The skeleton in front of him suddenly jerked and immediately fell to the ground without any signs of life. That black wave blah was pretty cool in his opinion, but he didn't know what it was called. He then thought about how the Lich was the final form of evolution of a mage, but he never had time to ask what kind of magic the skeleton used. Katal clenched his fists, realizing that all his questions would never find answers. The man thought that the liches in this world weren't that impressive, but in any case, a reward from the dungeon awaited him. He reached for the staff the Lich had previously discarded and thought about how the thing had glowed when he cast his spell. Katal thought it looked like a magical artifact, which led him to believe that by using it, he would be able to awaken magic. Then he picked up another blue crystal and stared at it in disbelief. The barbarian put all the finds in his pockets, thinking that it would be better to keep them for himself. As he was leaving, he stopped abruptly and opened his eyes wide, as if he had remembered something. He looked at the jug at his feet and thought that since this object belonged to a lich, it could be a vessel of life. The barbarian, not changing his habits, picked up the item and decided to show it to Rosa for evaluation. This seems to be the end of the artifacts in this dungeon. As soon as the barbarian thought about this, his gaze fell upon something truly interesting. Something like an ancient seal with a symbol in the middle appeared in front of him. Katal didn't understand what it was, but he assumed that there might be a secret room in front of him. He touched the seal with his finger, as if afraid of running into a sudden attack. Then strange clouds of black smoke began to emerge from the seal and fill the space. The seal crumbled as if it had never been there, and the barbarian began to feel guilty. He took a step back in case anyone could accuse him of breaking the seal. But in the place where there used to be strange magic, silhouettes of people now began to appear. They all stood with their heads bowed, shrouded in black haze. This was the secret chamber of the Lich Karos, and it turned out to be truly terrifying. Katal still didn't understand how to react to this, because he was now convinced that secret rooms exist. But at the same time, what he saw there made him take one step back. The man did not understand who all these people were in front of him and what they were doing here, and most importantly, whether they were alive. The barbarian approached one of the strangers and waved his hand in front of him. Then he approached the second one and loudly asked if they were still alive. But the room was still quiet, so Katal had to think of something else. He said that he had to leave for now and then headed towards the exit. The man decided that as soon as he reported the situation here, they would definitely send people to deal with the matter. That same morning, having reached the dialect, Katal immediately headed to the guild. He approached the table where Rosa was sitting, sorting through papers with assignments. The girl straightened up and smiled, greeting the barbarian. Rosa said that he returned earlier than usual today, and the barbarian replied that he had some business to attend to. Rosa asked him again about his business because she was truly interested in what the barbarian was doing. He smiled and started talking about the sphere he showed to the guild secretary yesterday. After listening to him, the girl was a little scared and asked Katal not to joke like that anymore, to which the man replied that he was serious. But the girl knew that Lich was one of 5 in the entire world, and he definitely could not be in such a place. But to confirm his words, Katal brought with him that very vase from the dungeon. The man said he brought the item because it appeared to be the Lich's life vessel and asked for its appraisal. It was as if lightning had struck Rosa. The girl froze in place, not understanding what was happening. Then a wave of realization hit her that Katal had not been lying to her or joking all this time. The girl's eyes widened, confused as to what was going on. Katal said that there were people inside that he wanted to get out, but their minds were empty. So he left them there. However, the guild should still send someone to investigate. Rosa looked down in fear and thought about how people in their area had been disappearing lately. But none of the missing were ever found. Rosa realized that perhaps this was all the work of the Lich. The blonde jumped up from her seat and exclaimed that the barbarian should wait a little because she needed to call someone. After some time, a frightened guard flew into the guild and asked if they were talking about the Lich. Katal, in response, looked awkwardly at the guard and waved, saying that he was pleased to meet him. Katal said that all respect and the guard cannot worry. He asked what the barbarian meant. The man clenched his teeth and asked fearfully if they were talking about Karos Branulas Kessis. Katal said that he seemed to have that name, and then asked if the guard knew him. Then the guard suddenly jerked from his place and exclaimed in a trembling voice that, of course he knew. Karos Branulas is a mage who turned the world upside down over a century ago. He is a creator of magic, manipulating emotions and causing endless chaos. The magician drove the kings mad and destroyed 5 kings, so is this creature now there among them as a lich? Thinking about this, the guard asked in confusion if this was really true. Katal said that he wasn't that impressive, because the magician just did weird things and ended up destroying himself. The guard couldn't believe that a mage of that level would simply self-destruct. He said he wanted a more detailed explanation. Katal rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said he had nothing more to say. The guard was momentarily stunned by this answer and stood frozen in place, looking at the barbarian in confusion. Then the guard calmed down and asked the barbarian to wait a minute, because he needed to report this to the master. The brunette looked at the guards in fear and asked what the hell was going on. He didn't understand what the lich was doing among them. The gentleman asked in confusion if they were absolutely sure it was a lich, or if there was a possibility that it was just a different type of monster. The guard replied that, judging by the testimony of those rescued, it seemed that it really was the lich. The guard said that they also had material evidence. The gentleman nodded, remembering that phylactery. The gentleman thought that a lich of such a level, hiding near the city itself, meant that the Empire could send investigators at any moment. Then the brunette thought that Lord Cain was not there, and he was the main force of the city. The gentleman immediately lowered his head, realizing that this was indeed a serious problem. And then the brunette abruptly hit the table and said that the guard needed to get ready to send a message to the capital. The brunette turned away and headed towards the window, thoughtfully saying that they were lucky this time. The guard said that if that barbarian had not found the lich, they could have become his first victims. The guard said that it was more likely that Karos was in the process of returning as a lich. The soldier said that this is why Karos's condition was unstable at that time. The brunette said that even so, it was truly an outstanding achievement, and therefore they should reward the barbarian in a proper manner. It was getting dark outside when the gentleman said thoughtfully that he hoped they could offer a reward that was within their means. And after some time, the morning finally came, and the bright sun had already risen into the sky. But the morning harmony was broken by a loud cry in the palace, which frightenedly called for the master. The man was in no hurry and slowly got out of bed, gradually putting on his shoes. Then the gentleman got dressed and said that he was already awake, and therefore the servants could let the guest in. And a few moments later, a bright and tall door opened, from which sunlight poured. The maid exclaimed in a trembling voice that the inquisitor of the sun god, Lord Aquaz, had arrived to them. And then the gentleman finally became frightened, his eyes wide open, and he asked again in bewilderment. At the same time, a girl with snow-white, long hair silently looked out the window. The gentleman asked in confusion what was going on and why the sun had come to them. A young girl with red eyes appeared before the master's eyes, who was the inquisitor of the sun god. After some time, a table appeared before their eyes, illuminated by bright sunlight. It seemed as if the bright rays were now everywhere. They were reflected in every object. The girl sat in a chair opposite the confused and madly agitated gentleman. Luke Barkin placed his hand on his heart and introduced himself, saying it was a great honor for him. The man sincerely thanked the inquisitor for her visit, and she fell silent for a moment. Aquaz also introduced herself, saying that she was a judge who punished the lost in the name of the sun god. Aquaz is the youngest person to hold this title. She executed 7 sorcerers who had made deals with demons and single-handedly disrupted their grand ritual. Aquaz is the strongest inquisitor of the sun god on the entire continent. Even the Empire bows to the teachings of the Church of the Sun. Luke understood that the power of the Aquas far exceeded the abilities of a mere territorial lord like himself. The master did not understand why she came to him. The inquisitor said that it seemed that there was a disorder in their territory. Luke replied that there had been a small problem with the dungeon nearby, but that the matter had been resolved. He realized that the purpose of the visit was not to hunt the Lich. Luke then asked if he could find out the purpose of Aquaz's visit, but she only remained silent. Aquaz coldly snapped that she had come to talk to Luke about her divine revelation. Ignoring the gentleman's shocked face, the girl continued speaking. Aquaz said that before she could tell, she needed to know more about the incident that had happened on their territory. Then Luke Barkhag looked down, confused, and began his story in a trembling voice. After a while, Aquaz looked at Luke in confusion, asking if it was really the barbarian who defeated the Lich. Luke lowered his head and said tensely that it was so, and also most likely the Lich was Karos Branulas Kessis. An image of a terrifying skeleton in a blue robe appeared before the girl's eyes. The girl said in confusion that they needed proof of the presence of such a creature on their territory. And at that very moment, the gentleman placed the vase on the table, saying that it was the phylactery of Kairos. The girl opened her frightened eyes wide, carefully examining the artifact. The girl muttered, asking what had happened to them while she clutched the sun-shaped pendant tighter. And then the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically when the girl decided to ask a question about the barbarian. Aquaz asked tensely if that barbarian was still in their territory. Luke looked up at the girl with his dark eyes, telling her that the barbarian was still on his territory. Then Aquaz looked down and asked how it was possible that the barbarian had defeated Kairos. Luke replied that now everything was possible because even the swordsman Cain was once defeated by him. At first, Aquaz was confused but quickly came to her senses and asked what tribe the barbarian was from. And the gentleman answered tensely that, according to the words of that barbarian, he came from the snowy wasteland. The girl asked again in bewilderment, could it really be that this barbarian had left the wasteland and that someone had managed to escape from those parts alive? But then the blonde lowered her tense gaze and thoughtfully turned to Luke. Aquaz said that perhaps this barbarian was the reason she was sent to these parts. The girl cast a tense glance at Luke and asked if she could meet that barbarian. And at the same time, before the barbarian's eyes, there was a small wooden chandelier. The bright rays of the sun had already managed to penetrate into his room, illuminating everything around. The barbarian twirled the crystal in his hands, muttering thoughtfully, asking how this device actually worked. Katal muttered that it looked like some kind of artifact that enhanced magic, so he should ask the mage about it later. But then the blonde suddenly opened his gray eyes wide, as if he had remembered something. Katal rose abruptly from his bed, glanced out the window, and realized that it seemed like the time had come. After some time, a guard appeared before Katal's eyes, who said that the Inquisitor of the God of the Sun wanted to meet him in the church. The guard stood at the threshold of the barbarian's house, asking him to show due respect when meeting her. The blonde smiled good-naturedly in response and said that the military man didn't have to worry about it. But then the guard's gaze fell on the barbarian's fist, which was tightly clenched. Looking tensely at the ashen barbarian, the guard asked if he was ready for the meeting. After a few moments, the guard came even closer and addressed Katal again. A couple of minutes later, the barbarian was already dressed and collected, so it was time for them to set out. In this world, gods do exist. They grant their powers directly and can even descend to earth themselves. The place where their followers gather is the church. Katal wondered what the difference was between them in fantasy and in the real world. After some time, they finally approached the church, and the barbarian began to examine the building. The church was made of white stone, its roof was made of gold, and in the center there was a silhouette resembling the sun. Katal looked at the huge building in fascination, clearly amazed by its scale and beauty. The guard said that someone would escort the barbarian after he entered the church. Then the blonde turned around and headed towards the church doors, but suddenly froze. Entering the majestic building, the blonde sighed heavily and looked around. Before Katal's eyes appeared a statue of a girl with the sun shining over her head. Then the man's gaze fell on the benches where soft sunlight fell from the huge windows. 3 nuns in white robes and with a sun pendant appeared before the man's eyes and greeted him. One of the girls bowed and then said that the Inquisitor of the Sun God was already waiting for him. The girl told the barbarian to follow her because she would lead him to the Inquisitor's office. He smiled back, confused. After some time, the silhouette of a girl appeared before the barbarian's eyes, and then he thoughtfully greeted her. The girl sat down at the table and introduced herself as Aquaz, who was an inquisitor. The blonde smiled good-naturedly and also introduced himself, saying that he was glad to meet him. Katal smiled and thought that if Aquaz was already an inquisitor, even though she was so young, then she must be truly gifted. The blonde looked tensely at the man's smile, wondering what he was up to. But the man suddenly interrupted her questions, asking why Aquaz had called him to church. The girl looked down and said that it was about the recent incident in the dungeon. Aquaz said thoughtfully that Kairos, whom the barbarian claimed to have defeated, had committed many atrocities throughout the world. Aquaz said that Kairos eventually became a lich, but only heroes can stand against him. Katal replied that he had heard about it, but the Kairos he had fought was a person who could not sit still and ended up destroying himself. Katal sighed heavily, saying that it seemed like Aquaz didn't believe his words, but he was simply telling everything he saw there. Aquaz asked if the barbarian would then agree to accept her god as a direct witness to their conversation. The Inquisitor said that if the barbarian lied to him, a sacred intervention would occur. Katal said it was like a lie detector, only the sacred version. Aquaz thought that even though Katal was different from other barbarians, he was still a barbarian and therefore would never agree to her request. She said that he could refuse. Katal asked why he should refuse, realizing that this was a golden chance to experience divine power on himself. He suggested starting as soon as possible. The girl thought in confusion that the blonde looked very inspired. The girl asked in bewilderment if this bothered the barbarian. He asked what she meant. The girl clarified that God was watching their conversation. Katal replied in bewilderment that until now he had said nothing but the truth. Pressing his hand to his heart, the blonde said that he had not lied, and the girl sighed in surprise in response. But then the blonde shook her head, throwing off the spell, and closed her eyes, suggesting to begin. With her hands clasped in prayer, the sun's rays began to reach out around her. The girl turned to God, who looks down from the highest place. A burning sign appeared behind her and a flame burst into flame. She cried out, addressing the God who guards the sun itself. The Inquisitor prayed to God to turn his gaze upon them and expose all the lies. And then flaming eyes appeared in the sky. A beam of the greatest solar energy was directed at them, illuminating the entire church. The barbarian raised his frightened gaze to the sky, which was filled with bright sunlight. It seemed as if a star was being born in the total darkness. Even the barbarian could sense this supreme presence. This creature had no face, no clear boundaries of the body. It was indescribable in human words. The barbarian watched the huge silhouette of the deity with curiosity, even sensing his feelings. A huge eye appeared in the sky among the flames, looking at the barbarian with a sense of confusion. But then there was only a bright beam of solar energy that was directed at the two interlocutors at the table. Aquaz tensed and thought that fortunately there was no sacred intervention. With her hand over her heart, Aquaz barely approached the blonde and said that then they could start talking. The girl said that from now on, no one could lie in the church anymore, and the man lowered his gaze in response. But a moment later, the guy smiled good-naturedly and nodded his head, saying that everything was fine. Then the Ash Barbarian and the Inquisitor had a very long conversation under the supervision of the Lord of the Sun. During this dialogue, the Barbarian answered questions about clearing the dungeon in the same way as before. But there was no sacred intervention, and the lies in his words were not revealed. Aquaz wondered if Karos might have been weakened, but if he had been able to use magic, the Barbarian would not have gotten out. But the girl was pulled out of her thoughts by a question from a man who asked if her doubts had been dispelled. Ivak thanked the barbarian and asked him to forgive her directly. He said that it didn't matter because he even liked it. The girl then looked up at the barbarian and asked if she could ask him one personal question. Having received an approving answer, the blonde fell silent for a moment, carefully choosing her words. And then, the girl carefully asked if the barbarian really came from the snowy wasteland. Katal opened his eyes in bewilderment and replied that it was. The blonde asked the same question again, but this time it was almost rhetorical. Aquaz looked at Katal with fear, thinking that perhaps this was the same barbarian from the Imperial legends. But then the man also asked if he could ask the Inquisitor a personal question, who was very surprised by such words. Katal looked at the confused girl with curiosity, asking why she had come to them. Then the blonde came to her senses and shook her head, saying that she had personal business in the city. Katal then asked if it was possible that this matter concerned the suspicion that he was a heretic. The girl looked up at the man with a puzzled expression and said that she didn't understand what he was talking about. And then the man remembered the look of the Sun Lord who was still watching them. Katal said he had little information on the matter, but for the Overlord to look down directly on you seemed to be a rare occurrence. Too much attention to simply prevent a lie. The girl closed her eyes tiredly and thought that she wanted to say no, but under the gaze of the ruler, lying was not allowed. The girl shook her head and said that was true. Katal asked if that meant he was the target from the start. And then the girl raised her determined gaze to the barbarian and said that this was not at all so. Aquaz said there was a divine prophecy. When she arrived in their lands, she thought the barbarian might be the one, but it turned out not to be true. The girl then shook her head and apologized, saying that she had actually hidden her intentions. Katal said that he even found it interesting in its own way, and then asked to ask one more question. Katal asked what the prophecy contained, and the girl looked up at him in surprise. Aquaz reflected that she usually shouldn't reveal the contents of the prophecy to anyone except trusted people, but this time was different. And then the girl clutched the sun pendant tighter and began to repeat to the man the contents of the prophecy. The man who had been listening to her attentively suddenly opened his eyes wide in surprise. After some time, the meeting finally ended and Aquaz found herself alone in the dark corridor again. But suddenly a man approached the girl from behind, opening a heavy wooden door. The blonde turned around in surprise, watching what was happening with tension. Luke Barkag walked into her room and smiled faintly as he took a step closer to Aqua's. The moonlight illuminated their silhouettes when the gentleman said that the girl looked worried. Aquaz said she had met a barbarian, but that only complicates matters. He asked what exactly Katal was. The girl looked out the window and said that Katal was indeed a barbarian from the snowy wasteland. The blonde said that, although she had not been able to obtain information about the snow wastelands themselves, at least his identity had been confirmed. Aquaz hoped it was a lie, but it was the undeniable truth. Luke said that if this became known, the world would be in turmoil. The gentleman thought that there were many who wanted to explore the snowy wastelands, including the Emperor. If the Emperor intervened directly, who knew what chaos would ensue? But his stream of anxious thoughts was interrupted by Aquaz, who asked him not to worry. The Inquisitor said that they would handle Karos's case themselves, and that they planned to hide the barbarian's existence from the public. The man looked down and thoughtfully asked if all the barbarians from the snowy wasteland were like him. Aquaz replied that if all barbarians were like that, they would have already left the snowy wasteland and conquered the world. It was true. Even without Katal, there were many barbarians in the world, and their military strength was considerable, but they were incredibly stupid. This was the inherent limitation of barbarians. Luke wondered what would happen if those who were a race of the highest level in strength also had intelligence. Luke said that they say that the current king of the barbarians is different from the previous ones and has both strength and intelligence. Aquaz replied that Luke spoke as if he had seen all the barbarians. She said that she had met the king once before, but he was definitely different from the usual barbarians. Luke replied that it would be interesting if the king met Katal. She insisted that she could not say the same, and then the man's eyes suddenly widened, only just realizing the meaning of what was said. Luke understood that the relationship between the barbarians and the servants of the gods was not at all friendly, so their growing power was rather a cause for concern. The gentleman asked what was the content of the prophecy for which Aquaz needed a personal meeting with him. The blonde responded indifferently that she needed confirmation, and Luke asked again, confused. Aquaz said she needed to check if Katal was human or something that had a human appearance. Then the man asked again about the content of the prophecy, and the girl in response only muttered his question again. But then the blonde finally decided to reveal herself. Lowering her head, she whispered the contents of the prophecy. Luke recoiled in fear and then asked in a trembling voice how this could have happened. But after some time, the darkness finally laughed and gave way to bright day. The sunlight spread throughout the room and was reflected even in each cup. Luke sat at the table with his arms folded, awkwardly asking how his interlocutor was doing. Katal sat across from him and said that he was doing well thanks to Luke. He asked why he had been called back. The brunette looked down and insisted that as the ruler, he had to say something to Katal. Luke first said that he wanted to express his gratitude for saving his lands from the Lich Karos. Luke said that if no one had stopped the Lich, their small lands would have been destroyed in an instant. And then Luke asked for forgiveness for something, and the blonde asked in confusion. Luke responded guiltily that the victory over Karos could not be made public. The Lord thought that the victory over Karos was an outstanding achievement, but this should not become known to the Emperor, lest he personally intervene. Luke decided that it was better to refuse the honors that Katal deserved. The same one replied that he did not care about it. The master said that this was not enough for an apology, but he had prepared a reward. And then the old man slowly opened a small green box. The blonde continued to look at the gift with curiosity, his eyes wide open. Then a small leather bag was placed on the table. The gentleman said that he was presenting an award given by the ruler. The blonde looked at the small gift in bewilderment, awkwardly asking the gentleman in front of him. The brunette replied that this was not an ordinary leather bag because if the blonde looked closely, he would understand everything. The barbarian looked at the small bag in his hand in bewilderment and asked the Lord again. But Luke interrupted him and asked him to look at what was inside the bag. He immediately began to untie the strings on it. And then the blonde's eyes widened in surprise, and the Lord said that it was an artifact in the form of a bag. The Lord waved his hand and said that Katal could store as many items as the pouch space allowed. The Lord said that the space inside was about the same size as the living room they were sitting in. Katal looked at the gift in bewilderment, thinking that this was the first time he had seen an object created with the help of magic. The Lord said that even if it seemed like an item would not fit into the bag, Katal would be able to put as much as he wanted in there. Then the Ash Barbarian grabbed his axe and thought that in this case he could test it. The blonde began to carefully push the axe into the bag, thinking that from the outside it seemed as if the object did not fit. But after just a few moments, the axe literally fell out of his hands and ended up in the bag, causing Katal to exclaim with delight. The Lord said that to get the item, you can put your hand in the pouch and imagine it. Katal pulled out the axe and exclaimed that it was amazing. Luke replied that it was a gift in gratitude for protecting his lands, and he hoped he would like it. Katal exclaimed that he not only liked it, he was delighted and would definitely find a good use for it. The Lord smiled and thought he was glad to see such a reaction. The Lord thought that they could end their business here and move on to the rest. He remembered asking about the prophecy. Cain said that distortions from the demon world were coming into their world, which meant that something was wrong. The Lord looked down thoughtfully and wondered if perhaps this could be related to the prophecy. The Inquisitor said that day that the prophecy spoke of a great evil coming into their world, which would descend upon them and spread throughout the world. The territory of Barkin is essentially a network of economically tightly interconnected villages. Thanks to this, the villages interact daily. One day, communication with one of the villages suddenly broke off, but at first no one paid any attention to it. But when days passed without news, the neighboring village sent people to check on them, but they never returned. Hearing this, the Lord sent guards to the village, but they too were unable to return. Only then did the Lord finally realize the tragedy of the situation, his eyes wide open in horror. Katal asked what their orders were for the day. Rosa answered seriously that they had an urgent request from the Lord. The blonde asked again, and Rosa replied that they needed to check the village from which the message had disappeared. Rosa said that a few days ago one of the villages stopped responding, and Katal just needed to go there and scout out the situation, but the payment for this would be quite generous. In response, the barbarian smiled brightly and scratched his chin, saying that he liked it, so he would take on this task. The girl immediately breathed a sigh of relief and thought that she had expected such an answer. A certain man with several swords sat near the wall, his eyes closed tiredly. Near the tree stood the priestess of Colossia, who was awkwardly rubbing her hand, standing far from the others. But after a few moments, the heavy steps of a man wearing iron boots were heard. The man walked up to Hayes and addressed her, and she just looked at him with a puzzled expression. Then the girl with short hair greeted Katal with a trembling and surprised voice. The barbarian smiled good-naturedly, and Hayes noticed that he had changed his clothes. He was now wearing a dark blue short-sleeved shirt, fur-lined gloves, and other furry details. Katal said that he took his new clothes from the tailor because the clothes he wore in his homeland were completely worn out. The priestess said that Katal's style was quite unusual and impressive. He replied that he had chosen it himself. Kalosi suddenly changed the subject and asked if Katal had also accepted that order. Katal smiled contentedly and said that he could not refuse such an interesting job. The priestess, however, was not surprised. The priestess said that Katal was indeed unusual. He asked if Kassan and Alessandro would not go with them. Colossia replied that they were supposed to receive information about the mission, so that's probably why they refused. In response, the guy nodded briefly and then turned around and looked around, lost in thought. Looking at the three frightened villagers in front of him, Katal said that there were fewer people than he expected. The barbarian thought that the task was simple and the reward was big, so it should attract a lot of people. Hayes said it was a dangerous mission. Katal said it seemed easy enough. She insisted the pay was too high. Colossia told Katal about rumors that the guards sent to that village never returned, so the task was not that simple. The blonde replied that too few people had come anyway. He had expected at least 10 people. Hayes then whispered to the barbarian that there was actually another rumor going around. He asked curiously. The blonde cast a puzzled glance forward, and the priestess immediately changed the subject and laughed. A silhouette of a girl with snow-white and long hair appeared before their eyes. Aquaz closed her eyes tiredly as the barbarian's attentive gaze turned to her. Even the Inquisitor of the Temple of the Sun God accepted this task, which Katal called simple. Hayes wondered if there were many mercenaries willing to work alongside the Sun God's Inquisitor. She asked if Aquaz was going to split her skull open. Katal smiled and replied that it would not happen because Aquaz was a polite and kind woman. Hayes asked fearfully if he knew the lady. The blonde immediately turned around and smiled, saying that he and Aquaz were friends. Colossia froze in surprise for a moment. The girl opened her eyes wide in bewilderment, wondering if the Inquisitor, heretic, and barbarian were really friends. And then, smiling good-naturedly, the blonde walked away from the frightened Colossia, who turned to him. Katal approached Aquaz and said he was glad to see her again. She replied that she did not remember when they became friends. The guy smiled even brighter and said that since Aquaz didn't remember, he suggested they become friends right now. But the blonde fell silent for a moment and then changed the subject, looking away from the barbarian. The blonde asked if Katal's companion, Lady Halrosia, really served another god. The guy opened his eyes wide in response and said that it meant that Aquaz was also familiar with Colossia. The Inquisitor agreed, and then asked if Colossia was a priestess serving the bedchamber of Halrosia. Katal asked if that was a problem. Aquaz said that this was not the case, but as far as she knew, Lady Halrosia's followers were currently in a period of rest. Aquaz said wearily that only those in high enough positions could act at such a time. But suddenly Aquaz stopped and said that she couldn't know all the details about every order of other faiths, so she must have been wrong. They turned their gaze to the frightened Colossia, but suddenly a man appeared in front of them and greeted them. The Ash Barbarian immediately looked away from the girl and glanced at a certain man in front of him. A captain of the guard appeared in front of the barbarian, and behind him were several more of the same military men. The blonde kept smiling brightly, saying that here they met again in the same place. But the priestess did not share the blonde's enthusiasm, swallowing hard from fear and freezing. The captain of the guard greeted everyone who accepted this order, and then said that if everyone was gathered, it was time to set out. After some time, the heavy thud of boots hitting the summer grass on the ground could be heard. Aquaz walked behind Katal and carefully examined everything that they encountered along the way. Katal looked around and thought that since they were all already gathered, they should soon begin the raid. Then the blonde found himself behind Aquaz and thought about something, looking at the bushes in front of them. Katal asked if since Aquaz had decided to intervene so soon, it meant that the time had come. But for a moment the girl was confused and opened her eyes wide, but then she only cast a puzzled look. Averting her red eyes from the barbarian, Aquaz said that she couldn't possibly talk about such a thing. Aquaz said that the gods did not reveal to them the exact signs of the fulfillment of the prophecy, but the village will also have a simple reason for the disappearance of people. Katal smiled brightly and asked if Aquaz meant that something worse was possible. He remembered the words of the girl in the church when she said that the gods warned her about the evil that would descend upon them. Katal turned around and smiled excitedly, already anticipating this descent of great evil. After a few more moments, the silhouette of several men appeared before my eyes. The guard said that they had finally arrived at that village. Katal immediately looked up with interest. Colossia opened her eyes wide in fear and then jerked sharply. Before their eyes appeared a very ordinary village, over which the sun was still shining high. The head of their city's guard said that they had all finally reached the entrance to the village. The guard asked what Milady thought about this. Aquaz replied that she did not sense a single living soul. The guard immediately shook his head and replied that most likely everyone else had simply run away. The man then turned around and ordered the men to spread out and look for any traces. The mercenaries and the rest of those present immediately agreed thoughtfully, looking at the village with fear. And the barbarian smiled brightly and exclaimed that he understood everything. The guard thought that judging by the size of the village, at least 100 people lived there. The man understood that such a huge number of people could not simply disappear without a trace. The man looked determinedly into the distance, realizing that there must be at least some clue. He ordered the search to begin. After some time, they found warm food with steam coming from it on the tables in one of the houses. The man who found the first clue looked at the freshly prepared food in surprise. The blonde ran out of the house abruptly, called the captain of the guard, and exclaimed that he had found food. The guard replied that it didn't mean anything, because the people were simply fleeing, and that's why they abandoned the food. And the man exclaimed in response that the food had just been prepared, because it was still warm and even steaming. And then the guard finally took the man's words more seriously, opening his eyes wide in fear. After a while, the guard looked at the bowl of soup with wide eyes and asked what was going on. The guard recalled that the residents of this village had not been in contact for at least several days. Since then, detachments have been sent to them, but not a single one has been able to return even though they were impressive. The guard turned around and asked if there was any other evidence. The man replied that there was no sign of escape or of anyone hiding. And then the head guard thought again, lowering the tense gaze of his brown eyes. Without taking his intense gaze off the food, the guard abruptly said that for now they needed to continue searching. The guard understood that there were all the signs that life was going on as usual, but at the same time, there was not a single living soul. The man then walked out of the house and approached the mercenary, wondering how this was even possible. The head of the guards asked the frightened brunette what was in that direction. In response, the mercenary awkwardly scratched the back of his head and said that everything was exactly the same on that side. The mercenary looked down and said that there was evidence that residents were there a few minutes ago, but now, no one. But even with warm plates of food and open doors on the streets, there was not a trace of a living soul around. The guard asked if she had any thoughts for Mrs. Aquaz, but she remained silent. After a few moments, the girl lowered her head and thoughtfully said that she didn't know either. The guard turned around and asked hopefully if Katal had managed to find out anything, but he was surprisingly silent. The man said thoughtfully that he also found nothing and did not even feel its presence. The guard muttered that it was crazy. Katal asked if they should ask someone who actually knew something about it. The guard immediately cast a frightened glance at the ashen barbarian, asking again in surprise. The blonde turned around and stared at one point, asking if the guard hadn't noticed someone's presence. The guard turned around in fear and, barely breathing, asked what the barbarian meant. He thought about the presence that was not there when they first arrived at the village, and then his gaze caught on an unfamiliar girl who was smiling softly and standing in the distance. He wondered who she was. The green-eyed beauty with long hair smiled softly and asked if it was taken. The girl said that she thought she had hidden perfectly since Katal had been able to spot her. The barbarian replied that she had appeared suddenly like a jack-in-the-box, but the girl leaned over and smiled, saying that ordinary people were not able to see her at all. She smiled slyly and looked at Aquaz, saying that even the sun god's inquisitor had not sensed her. The girl said thoughtfully that the barbarian did not at all look like someone who had experienced mysticism. Then the cunning girl smiled nastily and asked kindly who the barbarian was. But the man continued to look in bewilderment at the girl, who said that this was an unexpected catch. And only then did the guard finally come to his senses and open his angry eyes wide. He shouted in fear to the team that they needed to retreat immediately, and then rushed forward, covering them with his hands. The team immediately took off running, getting away from the terrifying creature as quickly as possible. But then the guard looked at Lady Aquaz with fear, turning to the motionless lady. The girl looked down in confusion and frowned deeply, saying that she didn't feel anything at all. Looking at the Inquisitor's frightened face, even the guard lost hope for a moment and turned his gaze to the monster. Colosia's eyes immediately widened and she barely flinched, realizing the situation. Hayes reflected that even the Inquisitor of the High Religious Order could not sense her presence. And so Colosia understood that this meant one of two things. Either she was not evil at all, or she was such a powerful demon that she could not be recognized. The Deviless sighed mockingly, saying that she was so sorry because she wanted to follow them and look at their lands. But then the girl's beautiful appearance seemed to melt away when she said that she had now decided everything. The girl's hand turned purple as long claws appeared on it. The surprised barbarian turned his gaze to the purple horns that grew on the devil's snow-white hair. The girl's skin turned red as she exclaimed that she would take this funny little barbarian as a slave and drag him to hell.